A boy arrived in Republic space, alone, silent. Every adult on the ship was dead, and no one knew who he was. This is the story of Darth Revan, the Jedi who never truly belonged, the forgotten origin, the blade without a past, the shadow before the storm. No birth records, no genetic signature, not even a name. The child was found drifting near the unknown regions, aboard a derelict freighter, its lights flickering, its engines long dead. There were no signs of battle, no distress call, just a dead crew and a boy who should not have survived. He was 6 years old, wrapped in a torn blanket, eyes open, staring at nothing. When rescue teams arrived, he didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just watched. The Jedi were summoned to investigate, not because of his survival, but because of what they felt before they entered the ship. The force inside that vessel was thick, unnatural. It wasn't darkness, it wasn't light. It was pressure, like something had been suppressed or contained. They scanned the boy, checked his blood. Midi-chlorians surged through him far more than expected. But it wasn't just his connection to the Force that disturbed them. It was how he used it, without meaning to. One night leaned too close. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly. A sharp ringing filled the air, and the knight staggered backward, reliving a nightmare he hadn't thought of in decades. The boy hadn't moved. That was the moment the council knew. He was not normal, and whatever brought him to them wasn't finished. They took him to Coruscant, clothed him in initiate robes, assigned him a room in the temple dormitories. He was quiet, obedient, and terrifying. The other younglings gave him names: Ghost, Voidborn, No Soul. None of them stuck. His file read, Initiate 4523 Auric. But he would not remain nameless for long. During sparring drills, he never raised his voice, never celebrated a win, but every movement was 42, precise, calculated, as if he knew exactly how his opponent would fall before the match even started. He never lost. The instructors praised his control, but whispered about his silence. No one had ever taught him to meditate, but when he did, the room grew cold. And then one night, they found him standing alone in the archive chambers. He had broken in, not to steal, not to damage, just to read. 1,000 years of Jedi history, lineage trees, Force rituals. When questioned, he said nothing. But the holoterminal still glowed with the last search. True origins of the Force. By then, some masters suspected the truth, that he wasn't just a lost child. He was a message, or a warning, but no one spoke it aloud, because the galaxy was not ready for what he might become, and neither was he. The Jedi Order was built to see the future, to sense conflict before it emerged, to feel disturbance in the Force before the galaxy could. But even the wisest among them often failed to see the cracks beneath their feet, and the boy was one of those cracks. He entered the temple like any other foundling. No fanfare, no grand announcement. Just a quiet placement into the initiate ranks, with a soft note in the archives. Potential unmeasured, background unclear, watch closely. And they did. The High Council watched him. The instructors watched him. Even the droids watched him. But none of them saw the storm beneath the stillness. He progressed quickly, too quickly. In lightsaber training, he was adaptable. In theory, he was relentless. When asked about Jedi history, he quoted forgotten battles with eerie precision events, not part of the standard archives. He claimed he dreamed of them, felt them. Some believed the Force was simply speaking through him. Others weren't so sure. During a meditation session on the upper levels, a visiting knight noticed something unusual. As the other children sat quietly in a circle, breathing as they were taught. This boy didn't breathe at all. Not visibly, not deeply. He just sat there, still as stone. And in the room around him, the walls began to vibrate, slightly, barely audible, but not imagined. He was reaching deeper, far deeper than a child should. The knight reported it to the council, but the council had heard it before. Similar things had been said of another child once, long ago. The word chosen was never used, not officially, not again. But the thought lingered, like a wound that never healed. Was this boy something new, or something old, returning? One master, Vandar Tokare, once said in private, "There is knowledge in him that predates his body." But knowledge was not the issue. Control was. During one trial, an illusion was used to test fear responses. A simulated loss, a fictional death. Each youngling was meant to recognize the illusion and remain composed. But when the boy saw the figure fall, he didn't freeze. He attacked, not the illusion, but the walls around it, the emitter systems, the memory banks. He collapsed the entire training chamber in less than 5 seconds. When questioned, he said only, "It wasn't real, but it will be, someday." He was suspended for a week, not as punishment, but as caution. The council debated his path, too powerful for expulsion, too unstable for knighthood, and yet too important to ignore. One night, Master Atris visited his chamber, not to lecture, not to teach, just to speak. She found him awake, sitting upright, staring out the viewport into the sky. When she asked what he was looking for, he answered, "I think I was meant to be something else. But someone changed that." She didn't understand, and neither did he. But the Force did. It had placed him here for a reason, not to heal, not to be saved, but to wait, because the galaxy was already dying, and something was coming, something that would need a weapon. A Jedi with no home, no memory, and no allegiance to anything but survival. There were thousands of younglings in the temple, from every known system, every culture, language, and creed. They trained together, slept side by side, ate at the same tables. But he was never truly with them. He followed instructions, he performed tasks, but he was always watching, never reaching. Some thought he was shy, others thought he was cold, but the truth was simpler. He didn't know how to belong, because he didn't come from anywhere. He wasn't taken from a family. He didn't remember a home. He had been alone before he arrived, and part of him still was. The temple taught unity, compassion, peace, but he felt none of it. He could hear their thoughts before they spoke, feel their fears before they even understood them. To him, it wasn't noise. It was weakness, not because he hated them, but because it made him feel further away. During lightsaber forms, he moved with precision, but without rhythm. He fought like someone who had already been in real battles, as if every movement was for survival, not practice. He was barely 10 when he started training with older initiates. Not because he asked, but because none of his peers could challenge him. Some resented him, others admired him, none understood him. He rarely slept. When he did, the temple droids noted abnormal brain activity, spikes of emotion, flashes of pain, followed by extended stillness. One healer claimed he wasn't dreaming. He was remembering. But of what? No one could say. In the archives, he began to spend hours alone, not seeking approval, not earning rank, just reading. Not the Jedi Code, not temple philosophy, but war records, Tyrannese conflicts, Ulsakan crusades, the beast wars of Onderon. He studied them like puzzles, each one revealing something the Order didn't teach. How peace was never permanent, how justice was always followed by collapse, how Jedi victories were often bought with silence or lies. A few instructors tried to redirect him, asked him to focus on diplomacy, negotiation, healing, but he never answered, because something inside him had already decided. He didn't believe in peace. Not really. He believed in preparation. Master Jar once confronted him after he bypassed a restricted archive terminal. "You're too young to understand what you're looking at," he said. The boy replied, "I understand enough to know we've forgotten what matters." The masters chalked it up to ambition, maybe arrogance, but it wasn't that. It was isolation. He saw the Jedi around him, bonded in tradition, legacy, and belief. And he knew he didn't share it. Not fully. Because even if he became one of them in title, he would always be something different in truth. The other younglings had childhoods, parents, memories. He had the Force. And a growing sense that it had not chosen him for balance. It had chosen him for conflict. Even in the quiet halls of the Jedi Temple, he was already becoming a warrior. Not through battle, but through absence. Because when you're surrounded by peace, but cannot feel it, that is when the first crack begins. He was 12 when they finally gave him a name. Not the one listed in his temple file. Not a placeholder from the archives. A real name, spoken aloud, meant to last. Revan. Some said it meant vanished one in an ancient tongue. Others said it came from the outer rim, something whispered by settlers beyond known charts. But none of them knew the truth. Not even him. It was given during a moment of ceremony, a rite of passage all initiates went through. But for him, it felt different. He stood beneath the stars, surrounded by masters cloaked in white and gray. They placed a training saber in his hand and asked him, not what he had learned but what he believed. He didn't answer right away. He looked around, at the skyline of Coruscant, the flickering lights, the hum of traffic below, and finally, he spoke. "The Force doesn't create peace. People do. But only if they're strong enough to stop what's coming." The council watched him in silence, not because they were surprised, but because they had heard similar words before. From soldiers, from fallen knights, from those who walked too close to the edge. But they still named him Revan, because they needed him to feel seen. Needed him to feel chosen. And because the Mandalorians were rising, they didn't say it aloud, but they felt it in the Force. A coming storm, distant, but real. Small border conflicts, rumors of raids, whole colonies vanishing without trace. Something was shifting beyond the outer rim, and the Jedi Order was hesitating. They debated, delayed, re-examined old codes. But the boy, now a Padawan, watched from the shadows of those chambers. He saw their fear wrapped in reason. He trained harder, dug deeper. He began asking questions no one wanted to answer. Why do Jedi wait? Why do we hold peace in one hand and let chaos burn in the other? His master, a calm and thoughtful woman named Kriya, tried to guide him. She believed in questioning, in doubt, but not in anger. Still, she saw the way he studied war, not as violence, but as clarity. Revan didn't crave conflict. He craved certainty. And in the legends of old Avulik Keldroma, Nomi Sunrider, and Exar Kun, he saw a pattern repeating. The Jedi always waited too long, always woke up when it was too late. He wouldn't make the same mistake. Not if the Mandalorians came. Not if they crossed into the Republic again. He would be ready, because deep down, Revan didn't believe his name was a gift. He believed it was a warning. He hadn't been born into peace. He had been pulled from death, given a second chance not to live, but to lead. And when the war finally reached the core, when the Jedi stood still, when the Republic began to fall, Revan would not, because long before he became a warrior, long before he was called a hero, he had already made his choice. The Force had brought him here, not to serve peace, but to rewrite it. The Force was never silent around him. Even in meditation, it moved, pulling, whispering, guiding. Where others had to reach for it, Revan simply listened. By the time he was 15, his reputation stretched far beyond the temple walls. He was a Padawan in name only. In truth, he was already something more. The masters debated who would train him. Some volunteered, others declined. A few were too cautious to touch something they didn't understand. In the end, it was Kriya who remained. She was never the Order's favorite. Her teachings wandered. Her questions pushed too far. But she believed in the power of thought, and Revan was thought made flesh. Under her, he consumed the archives. Histories of the Jedi Civil War, writings from Ossus, fragments from the earliest teachings of the Jedi. He didn't memorize them, he internalized them. He was studying not to learn the past, but to predict the future. Kriya watched this with both admiration and fear. She knew she was raising a mind that might one day outgrow everything the Jedi believed in. He trained in lightsaber forms, not to master one but all. By 17, he could switch between Juyo and Soresu mid-combat without breaking rhythm. But it wasn't his skill that set him apart. It was how he thought. He would ask questions that made his instructors pause. Why is peace our purpose if conflict is the galaxy's nature? Why must we serve the Republic if it no longer serves itself? Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in clarity. He wasn't defiant. He was awake. In diplomatic missions, he read a room before stepping into it. In training duels, he saw outcomes before a blade was raised. He was strategic, deliberate, unnervingly precise. Some said the Force had chosen him. Others said he was manipulating it. But both agreed on one thing: he was ascending too fast. And the Order was starting to feel it. Behind closed doors, whispers grew. Would he become a knight early? Would he be assigned as an emissary, even as a Padawan? But Revan didn't care for titles. He saw what the others didn't. Beyond the outer rim, something was stirring. Mandalorian scouts had begun testing the borders, outposts vanishing, colonies going dark, and the Jedi Council remained still. Revan noticed. He began mapping possible incursion points quietly, privately. He marked planets like Vanquo, Taris, and Dixon. He tracked patterns in the Mandalorians' movements, predicting paths before Republic analysts did. He brought his findings to the Council, but they dismissed him. The threat was not yet real, they said. Action would only provoke further war. The Jedi were not soldiers. But Revan had read history. He knew what happened when Jedi waited. He returned to Kriya, expecting support. But even she hesitated. She believed in knowledge, in inquiry. But war was not her domain. Revan didn't argue. He only bowed and walked away. He had asked for permission, and now he had his answer. The galaxy was changing, and he would not be left behind. The first real battle wasn't declared, it just happened. A mining colony on Vanquo went silent. No transmissions, no survivors. Then a second fell, then a third. By the time the Republic responded, Mandalorian warships had already crossed the Hydian Way. And still, the Jedi Council did nothing. They called it political. They called it uncertain. They said the Force had not yet spoken. But Revan had heard enough silence. He began speaking in the halls of the temple, not with anger, but with urgency. He gathered students, young knights, Padawans who had seen the signs too. Some called him reckless, but many listened. Because Revan didn't promise war. He promised leadership. He laid out strategies, predicted attack patterns, offered plans the Republic hadn't even considered. And then, for the first time, he said the words out loud, "If the Jedi won't act, then I will." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The Council summoned him, questioned his intentions, warned him of attachment to outcomes. But Revan wasn't attached to victory. He was attached to responsibility. He knew what the Mandalorians were. He had studied their history, how they thrived on challenge, on weakness, on hesitation. The Council's inaction wasn't neutrality. It was surrender, and he would not allow it. Word spread quickly. Other Jedi came to him first in secret, then in numbers. One of them was Malak. Larger, louder, and more passionate than Revan. Malak became his closest friend, and the voice Revan didn't raise himself. Together, they traveled to the front lines not as generals, but as observers. What they saw wasn't a war. It was a slaughter. Villages burned, cities taken, the Republic retreating on every front. Soldiers begged for Jedi support, but only Revan and his followers stood with them. He didn't disobey the Council. He simply stopped waiting for them. On Seriko, he directed evacuations while orbital bombardments fell. On Cathar, he watched the Mandalorians bury an entire species beneath the sea. That moment changed everything. When Revan stood on the shores of Cathar, surrounded by death, he found a single mask in the sand, a Mandalorian mask, worn by the warrior who led the massacre. He held it in his hands, felt the rage, the pain, the need, and he put it on. Not to hide, but to remember. He would wear it from that day forward not as armor, but as a vow. A vow to fight the war that others refused to see. He returned to the Republic with one message. The Jedi would no longer be silent. They called themselves the Revanchists, and Revan became something more than a Jedi. He became a symbol, not of peace, but of defiance. And the Mandalorians, one Revan, had finally met an enemy who would not break. The war changed everything, and Revan changed with it. He wasn't a general, not officially. The Council still refused to sanction the campaign. But across the Republic, Revan's presence became myth. He wore the mask every day now, not just in battle, in meetings, in strategy briefings. Even among Jedi, it had become more than armor. It was identity. To soldiers, he was a leader who fought beside them, not behind them. To Jedi, he was a symbol of dangerous independence. And to the Mandalorians, he was a challenge. They began to hunt him. On planets like Altha, Jaga's cluster, and Suurja, entire battalions were mobilized not to defeat the Republic but to kill Revan. And still, he survived. Because Revan understood war not as a contest of strength, but as a test of resolve. He fought with precision, not cruelty. But every act carried weight. He authorized planetary bombardments when retreat wasn't possible. He forced supply lines through Hutt-controlled sectors, ignoring treaties. He manipulated enemy communications to break alliances between clans. And slowly, he became more than a warrior. He became necessary. Malak, now called Malak, stood at his side. Towering, fierce, loyal. Where Revan was surgical, Malak was relentless. He followed orders, even when they burned worlds. Even when the line between Jedi and soldier began to vanish. Other Jedi joined them. Some reluctantly, some fully. They wore Revan's crest. Spoke his strategies. They were still Jedi in title, but not in spirit. The Council watched this unfold with unease. But their silence had birthed this movement. And now it was too large to stop. One by one, Republic systems began to turn the tide. Revan's victories were swift, coordinated, and brutal when needed. Entire Mandalorian fleets were scattered, their supply chains shattered. But with each victory, something else changed in him. He no longer asked what the Jedi should do. He asked only what they could do. And if the answer wasn't enough, he acted alone. The lines blurred further. Was he still a Jedi? Or something new? He still used the Force, still taught restraint, still saved lives. But his voice grew colder, his planning more distant. And when he meditated, there were whispers. He never told anyone what he heard, not even Malak. But some nights, the mask stayed on long after battle, as if it wasn't hiding his face, but protecting others from what he had become. He didn't seek power for its own sake. He wasn't arrogant, but something deeper had begun to take root. The belief that he was the only one who truly understood. And when belief turns into destiny, the fall doesn't begin with hate. It begins with certainty. The war was ending, but the fire was not. After years of devastation, the Mandalorians gathered for one final stand. Malachor 5, a shadowed world, long avoided, unknown to most, whispered about by few. Revan chose it, not because of strategy, but because something in the Force called to him there. He said nothing of it aloud, not to Malak, not to the Jedi who still followed him. But when he looked at that world, he didn't see a battlefield. He saw a mirror. He ordered the creation of a superweapon, the mass shadow generator, a Republic device designed to fracture gravity itself. Built by a loyal officer named Mitra Surik. She asked him if he was sure. He said only, "This ends today." The final battle began in orbit. Republic forces clashed with Mandalorian warships. On the surface, chaos raged, steel and blood, fire and screams. Revan descended into the heart of it. He fought his way through the Mandalorian lines, not to conquer, but to find someone. Mandalore the ultimate, the leader of the clans, the warlord who started it all. They faced each other with no words, no politics, only purpose. Revan struck him down, not with rage, not with triumph, but with necessity. And when the body fell, Revan removed the warlord's mask and took it, not as a trophy, but as a warning. He turned to the battlefield and gave the signal. The mass shadow generator activated. A wave of impossible gravity tore across Malachor 5. Ships collapsed into themselves. Thousands died in seconds. The planet screamed. And then, silence. The war was over. The Republic cheered. Revan returned as a savior. Statues were raised. Songs were written. Even the Council, though bitter, welcomed his return. But something had shifted. Not in the galaxy. In him, he had ended the war. But not the fire inside. Malak noticed it first. The long silences. The absent meditations. The missions taken alone. Revan had begun disappearing, leaving the known galaxy for days, sometimes weeks. He claimed he was hunting remaining Mandalorian warbands. But others knew better. He was searching for something ancient, something forgotten. He believed the war was never the true enemy, only the symptom. And somewhere, in the outer darkness, the cause still waited. The Jedi Council sensed it, but they didn't act, because Revan was still their victory, still their legend. They didn't see that he had crossed a threshold, not with violence, but with choice. He no longer trusted the Force to guide him. He trusted only himself. And when a man believes he's the last line of defense, he stops asking who he might become. Cathar was silent when they landed, too silent. The ocean winds didn't move. The trees stood still, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. To the soldiers, it was just another assignment, Another forgotten planet scarred by Mandalorian boots. But Revan stepped onto the sand and froze. Something was wrong. Not in the sky, not in the terrain, but underneath. The moment his boots touched the shore, he felt it. A deep pressure in the force, like a wound that never closed. They walked the perimeter, saw the bones. Old remains, bleached by sun and time. Thousands of them, scattered, layered, some fused into the rock. But it wasn't the bones that disturbed him. It was the feeling that they had never left. The Mandalorians had called this a pacification. The Republic called it a massacre. But neither word captured the truth. This wasn't war. This was something older than hate. Cathar had once been a peaceful world. The Cathar species were noble, loyal, fierce when provoked, but never cruel. They fought in defense, never in conquest. But the Mandalorians didn't come for conquest. They came to make an example. Entire villages were herded to the coast. Families, elders, healers. The warriors had already fallen. There was no battle, only execution, and the sea had watched it all. Revan knelt by the waterline, placed his hand against the sand, closed his eyes, and the force opened. He didn't see it. He felt it, screams, children crying, the rising panic of people who knew no one was coming. He felt the weight of footsteps, the heat of fire, the final breath swallowed by silence. And then, a sound he couldn't explain. A roar not from the living, but from the planet itself. As if Cathar had remembered everything. The Jedi who accompanied him said nothing. They felt it too. One of them, a quiet knight named Darren, broke into tears without knowing why. Another dropped to her knees and began to dig through the sand, searching for something she could not name. There was no Mandalorian armor, no battlefield tech, no banners, only bones. And in that moment, Revan understood something the Council had refused to see. The Mandalorian threat wasn't about territory. It wasn't about glory. It was about annihilation. The kind that leaves more than physical damage. The kind that stains the Force itself. He looked across the shoreline, to the cliffs where the Cathar had been cornered, to the waters where their ashes had been scattered, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't about defending the Republic anymore. It was about justice. Not the kind that asks permission, but the kind that demands reckoning. He stood up slowly, and in the quiet, he made a vow, one that no one heard. The war would end, not through peace, not through treaty, but through judgment. Because there are crimes so deep, the galaxy forgets how to speak of them. But the Force never forgets. And on the shores of Cathar, it remembered everything. The Force did not speak on Cathar. It screamed. That night, Revan remained alone near the shore. The others had returned to the command post, but he stayed. Not because of duty, because something in the ground was still calling him. He stood in the same place where the massacre had ended, and without words, without ritual, he opened himself to the pain that lived there. And the vision came. It was not a dream, not a memory. It was witness. He saw the Cathar, their faces calm, even as they were marched to the edge. Mothers shielding children, warriors kneeling, not in surrender, but in dignity. The Mandalorian stood above them, clad in armor, faceless, not angry, not cruel, empty. And then came the execution. Blast of fire, flames. The air turned to fire. No mercy, no hesitation. They weren't killing people. They were erasing a species. But the vision didn't stop there. Revan saw a woman. Cathar, tall, proud, unbroken. She stepped forward, blood in her fur, and stared directly into the eyes of the Mandalorian commander. She didn't beg. She didn't run. She only said, You will carry our names, in your blood, in your death." And she leapt into the flames, a force echo, pure and absolute. Her soul didn't fade. It marked the land. And Revan understood. This was more than tragedy. It was a scar. The Jedi had ignored it. The Republic had buried it. But the Force had remembered, and it had waited for someone to see. He stumbled back, gasping. The mask in his hands burned cold. The Mandalorian mask he had found half buried in the sand, rusted from sea and time, was not just a remnant. It was a witness too. The same commander who gave the order. The same face that watched the massacre. It had survived, just like the echo. And now, it had passed to Revan. He didn't put it on out of rage. Not to disguise, but to bear. To carry the weight of what had been done, and to remind those who would forget. When his Jedi companions returned and found him standing in the surf, masked, silent, unmoving, they didn't question him, because they felt it too. This was no longer a war about tactics or territory. It was something older, more personal. Revan didn't speak of the vision, but everything changed in him after that night. He no longer debated the council. He no longer waited for orders. He knew what had to be done. The Mandalorians could not be reasoned with. They didn't want negotiation. They wanted domination. And the only thing that would stop them was fear. True fear. Not of the Republic. Not of defeat. But of him. The mask became his face, not to hide behind, but to become the thing they would never forget. Because the dead of Cathar could not speak for themselves, so Revan would speak for them. Revan returned from Cathar changed. He didn't announce it, he didn't explain. But those around him felt it. He no longer fought for strategy. He fought for memory. The war became personal, not for revenge, but for truth. The truth that the Jedi had looked away. The truth that the Republic had buried. The truth that justice could no longer wait. The mask never left his face. Some whispered it was superstition. Others feared it was a sign of fracture. But they were wrong. It wasn't madness. It was focus. Every time he looked through the visor, he saw Cathar, the sea, the bones, the woman who burned, and he carried them into battle. The next time he faced a Mandalorian warband, he offered no warning, no surrender terms, no negotiation. He stood at the front lines, lightsaber ignited, violet and burning. And when they charged, they saw something strange. A Jedi, wearing their face. Some laughed, others hesitated, but Revan didn't. He moved with brutal precision, not wild, not angry. Each motion was calculated. One warrior tried to strike him from behind. He didn't turn. He simply knew. The blade arced, and Revan's saber met it without looking. A shift of the foot, a twist of the wrist. The Mandalorian fell, not broken, silenced. Word began to spread. The Jedi with the mask, the one who remembered Cathar, the one who never forgot. Some Mandalorian clans began to retreat before he arrived. Others sent champions, thinking they could kill the symbol. They failed, because Revan wasn't seeking victory. He was seeking balance, not in the Force, but in the blood debt the galaxy had allowed to grow. Every system he liberated, he left untouched. No looting, no executions. But always a message. Justice has a memory, and it wears a mask. Not all Jedi agreed. Some pulled away. Others reported him to the Council. But the Council was still silent. They watched from Coruscant as Revan's campaign grew. As he dismantled the Mandalorian advance, system by system. And still, they said nothing. Because they feared what they had created. And feared even more what they had abandoned. Revan knew. He didn't need their approval anymore. He wasn't fighting for the Jedi. He wasn't even fighting for the Republic. He was fighting for those who had no names, whose ashes were lost beneath the waves, whose last breath had never been answered. And in that fight, he found clarity. The light and the dark were tools, not prisons, not labels. The Council had feared the dark side because they believed it would consume them. But Revan had seen something worse than darkness: indifference. And that was a wound the Jedi could never heal. Only justice could, even if it cost him everything. The Council summoned him, not for praise, not for strategy, but for judgment. He stood before them, still masked, still silent. His victories had turned the tide of the war. His forces had liberated entire sectors. But that was not what they saw. They saw a Jedi who had stopped asking permission, who had spoken in absolutes, who wore the face of the enemy and called it justice. They asked him to explain, to account for his methods, to justify why he had defied their silence. Revan didn't argue. He only asked one question: how many more worlds needed to burn before you acted? There was no answer, only long faces and older voices. They spoke of caution, of balance, of restraint. But Revan saw what they truly meant: fear, not of the war, but of him, because they had lost control of the one they had refused to lead. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was simply done waiting. He left the chamber without bowing, without rage, without grief, only with certainty. The Jedi Order had made its choice, and so had he. He returned to the front, where he was needed, where people bled, where the Force cried out and no one listened. The mask was no longer symbolic, it was the line, and he had crossed it, not toward darkness, but toward something colder: clarity. Malak stood at his side, louder than ever. Others followed, still calling themselves Jedi, but their loyalty was no longer to the code. It was to Revan. He didn't demand it, he didn't declare it, but they knew. The Council would never understand this war, because they had never walked its ashes. And as the final campaigns began to form, as Revan began to press deeper into the Mandalorian holdouts, something deeper stirred. Not ambition, not power, separation. The Revan who once asked questions was gone. The Revan who waited for consensus had disappeared. All that remained was will. The will to finish what justice demanded. And behind that will, buried so deep he couldn't feel it, a fracture had begun. One the Council couldn't see, one Malak wouldn't dare name, and one Revan himself would never notice. Not until it was far too late, because the boy who arrived without a name had finally found one. And the Jedi who once sought peace was now the weapon the galaxy had called for. The Mandalorian wars were almost over. Entire fleets had fallen. Planets once taken in hours were now being retaken in days. And across the Outer Rim, one name echoed louder than any other: Revan. To the soldiers, he was more than a general, more than a Jedi. He was the edge of the blade they had needed since the First World burned. The Republic had always been slow to adapt, its leaders too cautious, its policies too old. But Revan had not waited. He didn't debate ethics during sieges. He didn't measure victory by treaties. He led from the front, with precision and presence. And in doing so, he became something far more powerful than a commander. He became hope. On Onderon, he rerouted a damaged fleet to flank the Mandalorian blockade. On Taris, he bypassed political channels and armed resistance cells himself. On Deeksun, he walked through the jungle alone to rescue a trapped battalion and returned carrying their wounded on his shoulders. Stories followed him, some true, some exaggerated. But all of them fed the same fire. To the Republic, he was the hero they needed. To the Jedi Council, he was the hero they had tried to stop. They still hadn't forgiven him. still hadn't endorsed his actions, but they could no longer deny them. The war was shifting because of him, but the man beneath the armor was shifting too. He wore the Mandalorian mask constantly now, not just in battle, in strategy briefings, in quiet conversations, in sleep. It had once been a symbol of judgment, a reminder of Cathar, a vow never to forget what the Mandalorians had done. But now, it was something else. It was distance. The mask gave him space, from the council, from his comrades, from himself. When people spoke to Revan, they looked at metal. When they followed him, they followed a myth. And slowly, the myth began to replace the man. Even Malak saw it. He never said it aloud, not yet. But there were moments, silent glances, long pauses where he looked at Revan and didn't know who was looking back. Revan's voice remained calm, his strategies clear, his goals unchanged. But his eyes had been gone for some time. Behind the mask, there was no room for doubt, no room for reflection, only purpose. He didn't crave power, he didn't seek control, but he had grown used to the galaxy needing him, used to being right when others hesitated, used to leading when others faltered, used to being the only one willing to pay the price. That burden had started as a choice. Now, it was a truth. And when the Republic declared him a hero, when statues were planned, banners printed, medals commissioned, Revan said nothing. He accepted the praise, not out of pride, but because it allowed him to move freely. Because as the Republic cheered, and the Jedi stood silent, he knew the war was not truly over. It was only pausing. And something deeper, something darker was still waiting. The Mandalorians had left scars, but Revan had begun to wonder who had given them their fire. What force had pushed them into war? What voice had whispered in their shadows? That question grew louder every time he stared into hyperspace. Every time he walked alone through ruined cities. Every time the cheers faded and silence returned. He had become the hero they needed, but something else had begun to need him. Something old and far from the light. The Mandalorian mask had no voice, but it began to speak louder than Revan ever did. At first, it was a tool, then a symbol, then something else entirely. It became the way people recognized him long before his name was spoken. It became the face of resistance, the warning of judgment, the shadow that followed the Mandalorians into their final battles. No Jedi before had ever worn the armor of the enemy. But Revan didn't see it as theft. He saw it as consequence. When he spoke to troops, the mask stayed on. When he visited burned-out settlements, it stayed on. And in time, the Republic stopped seeing it as strange. They accepted it, because the man who wore it kept them alive. But it wasn't just the soldiers who changed. Revan did too. He no longer noticed how often he wore it, or how rarely he removed it, not just from his face but from his mind. In the quiet hours between battles, when most Jedi meditated, Revan sat alone. He didn't listen to the Force. He listened to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the hollow kind, the kind that follows when purpose becomes armor. He still believed in the mission, still cared about the people he was protecting, but something within him had begun to drift. The mask had become his mirror, and he no longer liked what he saw beneath it. He told himself it was duty, that the war had simply taken its toll. But the truth was simpler. Revan wasn't sure who he was anymore without it. There were moments, brief ones, where it slipped. A quiet conversation with Malak, a child thanking him on a liberated world. The sight of a star he remembered from before the war. And in those moments, the mask felt heavy. Not physically, spiritually. Like it didn't belong to him anymore. Like it had taken something, but he always put it back on, because the war wasn't over, because the Republic still needed him, because the Jedi still didn't understand. And somewhere in the shadows of his thoughts, another reason waited, unspoken, unseen. He was afraid, not of death, not of losing, but of what he might find if he took it off and didn't recognize what was left. The Council had always warned of attachment, but they never spoke of identity, of what happens when a Jedi becomes more myth than man. Revan was no longer a Padawan, no longer a warrior, no longer even a Jedi not in practice. He was a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. One night, aboard his flagship, Malak entered Revan's chambers. Without knocking, he found him standing in front of a mirror, mask on, saber ignited, staring at his own reflection. He said nothing, just watched, and Revan spoke without turning. "Do you ever wonder who we were before all of this?" Malak didn't answer, because he didn't remember either. The war had taken pieces of them both. But with Revan, it wasn't just pieces. It was the center. Something inside was missing. Not broken, just gone. And in that absence, something else had begun to speak. The Force still moved through him, but it felt different now. Less like guidance, more like gravity, pulling, drawing, towards something he couldn't name. And the mask, it wasn't leading him away from the Jedi. It was leading him towards something older, something that had been waiting. Victory no longer felt like relief. It felt like silence. Each world reclaimed, brought cheers, banners, medals. But Revan stopped attending the celebrations. He stayed in orbit, alone, focused. The Republic saw liberation. He saw patterns. The Mandalorians were retreating, but not aimlessly. They were buying time. For something, he traced their movements across the mid-rim. Every retreat, every loss, it was leading somewhere. Toward the edge of known space, toward the unknown regions. And he couldn't look away. He didn't tell the Council. He didn't trust them to act. They were still sending messages of caution, urging restraint, balance, patience. But Revan had moved past patience. He began ordering strikes with brutal precision, not to punish, but to cut through the fog. Each battle became a scalpel, a tool to expose what lay behind the enemy lines. His commanders noticed the change. Revan no longer hesitated, no longer second-guessed. He struck first, hard, always with purpose. But the cost was rising. Entire cities razed to prevent enemy regrouping. Supply chains sacrificed for faster advances. Allies left behind to preserve momentum. The Jedi who still followed him began to ask questions, not in defiance, but in confusion. Had the mission changed? Revan never answered directly. He spoke of necessity, of endings, of something worse waiting in the shadows. Malak, for his part, did not question. He welcomed the shift. Where Revan grew silent, Malak grew louder. He commanded fleets with fire, took glory in battle, celebrated what Revan endured. But deep down, even Malak knew something was shifting. Not in the war. In Revan, there were days when he would disappear for hours. No explanation, no report. Only to return with new orders, more aggressive, more calculated. His eyes behind the mask were different, colder, not angry, just tired. Tired of carrying it all. Tired of waiting for someone else to see what he saw. He began seeking out ancient places, worlds the Jedi had forgotten, ruins buried under centuries of silence. On Dantooine, he stood in the old grove where Master Vodo once taught. He said nothing for hours, just stood beneath the trees, listening. On Korriban, he paused before the Valley of the Dark Lords. He didn't step inside, not yet, but he felt its breath. Each victory drew him closer, not to peace, but to a door that had no lock. Only a question: if no one else will protect the galaxy, are you willing to do it alone? Revan never said yes. He didn't need to, because every move he made answered it. Even when the war reached its final breath, even when the Mandalorians began to splinter, Revan's pace didn't slow. It sharpened, because he knew the end of this war was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of something darker, something older, something that had been waiting behind the noise of battle. And as the galaxy began to heal, Revan didn't, because healing requires rest. And Revan had already forgotten how to rest. When the war finally ended, Revan did not celebrate. He didn't attend the victory ceremony. He didn't return to Coruscant. He just stood at the edge of the galaxy staring into the dark. The Republic rejoiced. The Jedi breathed again, but Revan felt none of it. Because while the Mandalorians had fallen, something else had risen. He had seen it. In glimpses, in the patterns of retreat, in the places where their ships vanished beyond the star maps. He had traced their routes, and every path led into the unknown regions. There was a reason they went there, a reason no one else dared follow. He could feel it, calling, not like the Force used to. Not with peace, with gravity. The same gravity that had been pulling him since Cathar. The same whisper that had followed him from battle to battle. It wasn't darkness in the way the Jedi described it. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hate. It was purpose, absolute and final. He had fought for the living, but now he was being drawn by the dead. By something ancient. Something that waited before even the Republic had a name. He gathered what remained of his fleet. Loyal Jedi. Republic officers. Those who still believed he saw further than anyone else. They didn't question the destination. They trusted him completely, because Revan had never been wrong. Malak asked once where they were going. Revan only answered, to where the real enemy hides. He didn't elaborate, because he couldn't explain what he didn't understand. Only that the war they had just fought had been a shadow of a greater one. The Mandalorians had not been leaders. They had been pawns, and whoever had moved them from the darkness was still there. He felt it more each day, the voice behind the silence. Ancient, patient. A presence that did not seek to be found, but expected to be. It was waiting for him, and he knew, without reason, that this was not the first time. It felt familiar, too familiar, as if every step of his life had been leading back to it. He still wore the mask, but now, it was no longer the face of judgment. It was armor for what was left of him. The man beneath it was fading. Malak noticed it, the others ignored it, and Revan accepted it. Because what he was becoming felt inevitable. He had defied the Jedi, defied the war, defied fate itself, and yet, something greater still waited beyond his reach. He no longer sought peace. He no longer sought victory. He sought understanding, and for that he would cross any line, even the one between light and dark. When his fleet vanished into hyperspace beyond the edge of known space, the Republic marked it as a final mission. The Jedi called it desertion, a quiet betrayal. But history would remember it differently, because the man who wore the Mandalorian mask was no longer chasing enemies. He was chasing truth, and in doing so, he stepped into the one place where even the Force refused to follow, the unknown. There were no maps, no trade routes, no reliable charts, only rumor and instinct. When Revan's fleet crossed into the unknown regions, it wasn't following coordinates. It was following something deeper, a whisper in the Force, a pull beneath the silence. He didn't explain the mission. He didn't ask for volunteers, but they followed anyway. because he was Revan, and because he had never been wrong. Days passed without signals, weeks passed without contact. Star after star, cold and unmarked. Some of the Jedi aboard began to question the path, not because they doubted the danger, but because they could feel something else, something watching. It wasn't the presence of life, it was the memory of death. They passed planets stripped of their atmospheres, stations left hollow and adrift, technology older than the Republic, but untouched by time. Each step deeper, each system darker. Revan said little. He studied every reading, every distortion in the Force. What he sought wasn't just an enemy, it was a cause. Because the Mandalorians had not acted alone. He knew that now, their rise had been too fast, their tactics too perfect. They had been guided, not by a warlord, but by a shadow. He felt it, not around them but ahead. Something ancient had moved through these stars, and it had not gone. It had only been waiting. They reached a system without a name. 3 dead worlds, a red dwarf sun, and in orbit, something impossible. A space station miles wide, untouched by decay. No lights, no signals, but it was there, waiting. The fleet held position. Revan took a single shuttle. No escort, no conversation. He docked alone and stepped into silence. No defenses, no resistance. Only corridors of black stone and whispering air. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The Force was heavy here. Not hostile, not welcoming, just present. It pressed against his chest, coiled in his thoughts. Every breath was effort, but he kept walking, because he knew this was not a ruin. This was a throne room, and the throne was not empty. In the core of the station, he found it. A chamber perfectly preserved. Walls inscribed with languages older than the Republic itself. Symbols that bent the eye. Voices, faint but constant. And a mural, spanning from floor to ceiling. Dozens of Sith, hundreds of wars. A lineage of darkness that had never been broken. Not destroyed, only hidden. The Sith had not been gone. They had gone quiet. And someone, had kept them that way. A presence stirred. Revan turned. No figure, no face, only a voice. It didn't echo. It simply existed. "You have come far, Jedi." It was not a question. It was not impressed. It was inevitable. Revan said nothing. Because the Force inside him was already reacting, not in defense, not in fear, in recognition. He had found what no one else believed existed. Not a hidden Sith cult, not a surviving lord, but a living empire, and its emperor had been waiting for him. The voice did not speak again. It didn't need to. Revan stood in the center of something far older than the Republic. Something far more patient than the Jedi. This was not a temple, not a battlefield. It was a design. Every stone, every corridor, every whisper, it was all engineered. Not for comfort, not for beauty, but for control. The Sith who had once ruled the galaxy had not died out. They had adapted. They had survived exile, betrayal, extinction, by becoming something else, and now they were ready to rise again. Revan felt it not in words, but in the pressure of the Force itself. There was an intelligence here, vast, cold, calculating. It did not rage, it did not preach, it waited. And in that waiting, it planned. He explored deeper into the construct, this impossible fortress in the stars. Every room he entered told another story. Of conquests, of kings, of conquests, ancient pacts, artifacts sealed behind transparent steel, holocrons emitting frequencies his ears couldn't translate, Sith texts written in languages that had no spoken form. But it was the absence that haunted him most. No Sith walked these halls, no soldiers patrolled its walls. And yet, Revan felt completely surrounded. Every movement was watched, every thought mirrored. This was not an archive, it was a mind, and it was learning him. The Sith had not simply waited in silence, they had refined their silence into a weapon. Beyond this station, Revan found other remnants, worlds scarred by unnatural decay, ships drifting in orbit intact, but empty, populations removed, not slaughtered, not for cruelty, but for study. They weren't fighting the galaxy anymore, they were preparing to replace it. He found coordinates mapped in red, thousands of them, each one a Republic system, each one tagged with projections, not for conquest, but collapse, calculated years in advance, based on trade flow, on military recruitment, on political weakness. The Sith weren't planning a war, they were planning inevitability. And the voice, the one that had first greeted him, it returned, but not with threats, not with temptation, with truth. We are not your enemy, Revan. We are the truth of the Force, the end of chaos, the order that waits at the end of all things. Revan didn't answer, because part of him already understood. The Jedi had spent centuries maintaining peace they couldn't control. The Republic had survived every war by falling deeper into corruption. And here was something that worked. Cold, unyielding, but functional. It didn't demand belief, it demanded surrender. And Revan, for all his resistance, couldn't look away. He should have felt fear, but what he felt was clarity. This was not madness, this was design. And for the first time, he understood the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something too vast to speak. And it had chosen to reveal itself to him. Not to test, not to corrupt, but to invite. The voice had no form, but it filled the chamber like a living thing. It didn't echo, it inhabited the silence. Revan reached for his saber out of instinct, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't bound by the same rules as the Force he understood. A figure began to appear, faint, almost human, tall, cloaked, defined by shadow. But the darkness around it wasn't absence, it was power, and it moved like a storm under his skin. The Emperor of the Sith. He had been called many names across fragments of galactic memory. But here, in the unknown regions, he was something else. Not a name, not a man, a presence. It spoke again, quiet, calm, inevitable. I have ruled from the darkness for 1,000 years. The galaxy you serve is a lie. Peace is the greatest deception of all. Revan did not answer, because something within him agreed. The Jedi had claimed peace as their highest virtue, but that peace had failed to stop the Mandalorians, failed to protect Cathar, failed to change anything. And this being, this Sith Emperor, had seen it too. You are not like the others, the voice said. You have seen the truth of war. You understand that power must serve purpose, not restraint, not denial. The Force trembled around them. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, alive with dark energy. Images flickered, wars that had never been recorded, planets consumed by fire, civilizations erased in silence. Revan felt all of it, not as fear, as understanding. The Emperor stepped closer, not in body but in presence. The Jedi fear me because I have no limits. The Sith obey me because I have no mercy. But you, Revan, you could stand beside me. The offer was not seduction. It was logic, pure and clean. The Republic was fragile, the Jedi hypocrites. And here stood the one force in the galaxy that endured everything. Revan's mind resisted, his body did not. The force bent around him, neither light nor dark, just motion. He had never felt such power. Visions struck him all at once. The galaxy burning, the Republic crumbling, the Jedi scattered like dust. And through the ruin, order, cold, efficient, unbroken. He saw what the Emperor saw, a galaxy purified of weakness. For a moment he believed it. For a moment it felt right. Then came the pain. The Emperor pressed deeper, not through words, but through the Force itself. Revan's memories fractured, his will buckled. He saw himself from the outside, saw his wars, his victories, his defiance stripped of meaning. He was just another instrument, another piece in something far larger. And he understood. The Emperor had not been waiting for anyone. He had been waiting for him. Because Revan wasn't chosen by the Force. He was led by it, drawn into this place, into this confrontation, into this surrender. But the Emperor miscalculated. Revan didn't kneel. He didn't yield. He simply looked up and saw what had to be done. If this darkness could not be destroyed, then it had to be contained, even if that meant using it. He reached into the current of power surrounding him, felt the cold, endless flow of it, and he did not turn away. He didn't fall. He absorbed. For the first time, Revan touched the full scale of the dark side, and it did not consume him. It recognized him. Because he was not its enemy, he was its reflection. And the galaxy would never recover from what that meant. When he left the throne world, he was not the same. He had not been conquered. He had changed. The fleet waited in orbit, unaware of what had transpired below. To them, he was still their commander, their savior, the man who had ended the Mandalorian wars. But when Revan returned to the bridge, silence followed him. Every Jedi aboard felt it. A coldness that was not anger, a stillness too deep to name. He gave no explanation, no record of what he had found, only a new order. They would return to the galaxy, not as heroes, but as architects. He had seen the truth of the Sith Emperor's plan, and he understood it. The Republic was too weak to survive the next war. The Jedi were too bound by mercy to prevent it. If he told them what he had discovered, they would hide, debate, pray, and the galaxy would die waiting for their permission. So Revan chose deception. He would become the thing they feared to save them from what they couldn't see. His fleet followed him without question. The mask still hid his face, but the voice behind it had changed. Colder, measured, certain. Malak saw it before anyone else. He didn't recognize it as corruption. He saw it as clarity. Together, they began to rebuild, to fortify the outer rim, to prepare for the coming darkness that only they believed was real. But preparation soon became ambition. Defense became control, and control became conquest. One by one, systems fell in line, not through fear of destruction, but through belief. Revan promised order. He promised strength. He promised a galaxy that would never know weakness again. And people listened, because the Republic had failed them for generations, because the Jedi had turned away when they cried for help. Revan didn't turn away. He was no longer fighting for the light. He was fighting for survival. The galaxy's, and perhaps his own. Malak called it destiny. Others called it prophecy. But Revan knew better. It was a decision, the kind the Jedi were too afraid to make. He told himself this was the only way, that the dark side was a weapon, not a prison, that his will was strong enough to guide it, to bend it, to use it. But power never bends, it waits. And in the quiet hours aboard his flagship, when even Malak was gone, Revan felt the Emperor's voice again. Not as command, not as memory, as presence. It wasn't gone. It had never been gone. It lingered inside him, patient, observing. He had taken part of the darkness with him when he left that world. And now, it was watching through him. The man who had gone to destroy the Sith had returned as their heir. Not by oath, not by faith, by choice. He didn't kneel to the dark side. He wore it as he once wore the mask. Because to save the galaxy, he would have to become everything it feared. The line between savior and conqueror had vanished, and Revan no longer cared to find it. He came back without warning. No declarations, no negotiations. Just ships, thousands of them appearing in outer rim skies. The galaxy had thought him lost. A war hero turned wanderer. Some believed he had died in the unknown regions. Others whispered that he had gone looking for something older than the Force. But Revan did not die. He returned. And he did not come back as a Jedi. He came back as a conqueror. The Republic didn't understand what they were seeing at first. The symbols on the hulls were foreign. The tactics, brutal. The strategies, flawless. Entire systems surrendered without a fight. Others fell within hours. And leading the charge, not a senator, not a Sith by name, but a shadow wearing the face of salvation. The mask was the same, but the voice behind it was not. Revan no longer made speeches, no longer explained. He acted. He no longer answered to the council, no longer paused for reflection. Because there was no doubt left in him. The war he had prepared for had already begun. But this time, he would fight it his way. From the ashes of war-torn colonies, he built a new empire. Not one ruled by corruption or religion, but by purpose. The Jedi called it a betrayal. The Senate called it terrorism. But the people listened, because Revan brought stability. He punished warlords, restored order, and wherever he went, violence stopped because fear followed just behind him. His fleets didn't occupy, they replaced. Governors who exploited their worlds were removed quietly. Criminal syndicates that controlled trade lanes vanished. And with every system that fell under his influence, the illusion of Republic peace cracked further. He didn't call himself emperor. He didn't need to. Because power, when absolute, doesn't announce itself. The Jedi Order scrambled to understand what had happened. They sent envoys, spies, warnings. They asked how Revan could fall so far, so fast. But the truth was harder to accept. He hadn't fallen. He had returned. And what came back from the unknown regions was no longer Revan the savior. It was Revan the inevitable. Behind the mask, there was no malice, no cruelty, just silence. And that silence was more terrifying than hate, because it spoke of conviction, of a man who had once followed the code and found it hollow. Now, the Force served him, his will, his war. And every planet that refused him was reminded of what a Jedi looks like when they no longer ask for permission. He didn't build a throne, he built a command deck. Steel, glass, and silence. No banners, no rituals, no symbols of the Sith, just maps. Lines stretching across sectors, systems marked in red, fleets calibrated with surgical precision. This was not the throne room of a tyrant. It was the mind of a strategist. But even strategy has a center. And at that center sat Revan. He didn't rage. He didn't command with fire. He didn't deliver speeches that echoed through space. He simply gave orders, and they were obeyed, because no one questioned him anymore. Not the admirals who once served the Republic. Not the Jedi who had followed him through the Mandalorian Wars. Not even Malak. They had all seen what waited beyond known space, and they all understood the lie they were leaving behind. Revan's war was not about revenge. It was not about dominance. It was about preparation. because what had spoken to him in the dark was still watching, still waiting. He couldn't destroy it, not yet. So he would reshape the galaxy instead, so that when it returned, when the true war began, it would find a civilization worthy of survival, a civilization forged in fire, not philosophy. His enemies called him a tyrant, but his soldiers called him necessary. Every time he destroyed a corrupt governor, every time he collapsed a criminal empire, every time he rewrote a world's laws, overnight he became something more than a man. He became a constant, and constants don't break. But something inside him did, not all at once, not with pain, with silence. There were moments, alone in his chambers, where time felt off. He would stare into hyperspace and lose track of minutes, hours. He would see flashes, not memories, images of things that hadn't happened, or hadn't happened yet. Whispers that did not speak in words, commands that didn't sound like commands, just certainty. He still believed he was in control. But the voice he had walked away from in the unknown regions, the one that called itself Emperor, had not truly stayed behind. It had marked him. The moment Revan opened himself to the power behind that ancient throne, he became a vessel, not one of weakness, one of intention. The Force flowed through him as it always had. But now it carried something colder, and with every decision Revan made, every victory, every planet brought under control, he fed it. Not through worship, through will, and the dark side rewards will. But the light remembers. Somewhere beneath the armor, buried under plans and masks and logic, there was still the Jedi who had wept for Cathar. Still the young boy who had searched the archives, not for war, but for truth. That part of him had not vanished. It had been locked away. And sometimes, when the fleet slept, when the systems fell quiet, that part of him would scream, not aloud, but inside. He would wake from meditation with his hands clenched, his throat dry, as if he'd been arguing with something or someone who no longer existed. The Jedi called him lost, but Revan was not lost. He had simply moved beyond what they could recognize. Because no one wanted to admit the truth. The galaxy needed him, and it didn't matter who he became to give it what it needed. The Jedi didn't forget him. They couldn't. No matter how many systems Revan claimed, no matter how far he drifted from their teachings, his shadow still touched the temple walls. Some knights had once trained beside him, others had fought beside him, and still others had been saved by him. But now, they could no longer reach him. He didn't answer messages, didn't respond to envoys, didn't return to the council, and yet something lingered in the Force. A presence, not dark, not light, just strained, as if Revan hadn't fallen, as if he were holding something back. There were stories uncertain, unofficial of him sparing Jedi, letting retreating ships escape, avoiding battles he could have won in minutes. And in those moments, some believed that the Jedi was still inside him, buried, but not broken. Master Vrook denied it. Atris condemned it. But one voice never gave up. Kriya. She had been cast out by the council long before Revan's fall. Not for her power, but for her questions. She never stopped searching for him. Not with ships, not with scouts, with thought. Because she understood something the council never did. Revan didn't fall to power. He followed truth wherever it led. And sometimes, truth doesn't end in light. Sometimes, it leads through shadow. Kriya meditated for days without sleep, reaching across the stars, listening to the broken echoes in the Force where his presence used to be whole. She didn't find darkness, she found fragments. A soul stretched thin, still fighting, still reasoning, still questioning. He hadn't been consumed, he had been divided. And that was worse. because it meant Revan still remembered who he was. Even as he rewrote what he would become, there were still Jedi who defended him. Quietly, carefully. They argued that Revan was preventing worse conflict, that he had seen something the Order refused to acknowledge. But even they spoke in hushed tones, because to say his name too loudly felt like opening a wound that had never healed. And to some, it was more than a wound. It was a prophecy betrayed. There had been whispers once that Revan might be the one to bring balance. Not because he obeyed, but because he understood both sides. And that understanding had taken him too far. But Kreia never stopped believing in the man beneath the mask. She had taught him to question, and now she questioned everything. Was his fall a failure? Or was it the only path left? Was Revan wrong? Or were the Jedi simply afraid to follow? When she spoke to others, they dismissed her. But when she spoke to the Force, she felt something different. Not absence, not rejection. Something else. Regret. Not hers. His. Even across the void, even through the chaos of his empire, Kreia could feel it pulsing from him. Revan regretted. Not the wars, not the throne, not the mask. He regretted what it cost. Because for all his certainty, for all his control, for all his vision, Revan had no one left to speak his name as a man. Only as a symbol, a shadow, a warning. And somewhere beneath the steel and silence, the Jedi was still listening. Kreia never saw him return. Not truly. Not as the boy she once taught. Not as the Jedi who questioned everything. Not even as the general who saved the Republic. She saw only a figure distant, veiled, armored by silence. But even then, she believed. Not in what he had become, in what still remained. Because Kreia didn't teach obedience, she taught doubt. And Revan had once listened. So she followed the trail he left behind, not through systems conquered, but through decisions hesitated. She found reports of battles avoided, of Sith Lords appointed by Revan, then mysteriously removed, of Republic envoys who vanished, but were never harmed. And in those gaps, she saw traces of the man who had once searched for peace. Revan had not destroyed the Jedi. He had outgrown them. And yet, she knew, he had not escaped them. Because the Force does not forget its own. It waits. It watches. And when it senses conflict, it returns. So she reached again, through meditation, through memory, through pain, and she found him. Not in clarity, in fracture. He was split, two voices in one mind. One spoke of destiny, the other screamed for silence. But neither voice was free. Kreia understood then what the Council never would. Revan had not chosen darkness. He had held it back. He had worn it like a second skin, not to destroy the light but to protect it from something worse. She felt his exhaustion. The weight of secrets never spoken, the burden of leading without love, of commanding without rest. He had given everything, his soul, his peace, his identity, to stop a threat no one else could see. And no one had thanked him. They called him traitor, madman, Sith, but not savior, not sacrifice. She remembered his first lesson as a child. The Force guides us. But now, she saw the deeper truth. The Force uses us. And Revan had been used more than any Jedi before him. So she waited. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but for return. Because even fallen stars leave light behind. And Revan, for all his cruelty, his control, his silence had not extinguished his light. He had buried it. Beneath armor, beneath war. Beneath the mask no one dared remove. But she believed it was still there. And she knew that someday, someone else would reach it. Not through power, not through force, through remembrance, because love remembers what fear forgets. And even legends, even tyrants need to be remembered not just for what they became, but for who they once were. His fleets controlled the outer rim. His enemies were either shattered or silent. Worlds once ruled by chaos now bowed to his name. But the war didn't stop. Because Revan didn't stop. He told himself it was necessary. The true threat, the one buried deep in the unknown regions, was still coming. And until the galaxy was ready, until it was unified, the war could not end. Not yet. So his forces pressed forward, not with cruelty, but with precision. One world after another secured, stabilized, assimilated. He wasn't conquering. He was preparing. But the people began to whisper, even those who once followed him with reverence. Some questioned his silence, others his purpose, and a few began looking elsewhere for answers. One of them was Malak. He had once stood beside Revan as a brother, laughed with him, bled with him, believed in him. But now, he stood behind him. And in the quiet space between victories, Malak began to wonder if Revan still saw him. At first, he dismissed the feeling. Revan was always focused, always calculating. It was who he had always been. But the mask no longer came off. And the voice behind it, the one that once spoke of justice and duty and peace, had grown colder. Revan issued commands, but not explanations. He made decisions, but not conversations. And slowly, Malak stopped feeling like a brother. He started feeling like a weapon. Others noticed too. Commanders loyal to Malak whispered of hesitation, of growing tensions, of Revan seeing threats where none existed. Some feared rebellion, others feared stagnation. But Malak feared something else: irrelevance. He had followed Revan through war, through exile, through darkness itself. He had stood by him as Jedi turned their backs, as the Republic called them traitors, as the Council abandoned their name. But now, Revan didn't need him. Not to lead, not to speak, not to think. He was a class, shadow following a greater shadow. And that shadow Revan was beginning to eclipse the very galaxy he once vowed to protect. Malak wasn't the only one who saw it, but he was the only one close enough to change it. So he waited, not with anger, not with hate, with logic. Because if Revan had truly lost himself, if he was no longer the Jedi, no longer the general, no longer the man, then someone would have to take his place. And if Malak didn't do it, someone else would. Revan never saw the betrayal forming. He saw planets, he saw pieces, he saw patterns. But he didn't see people anymore. He didn't see Malak, the friend who had once walked through fire for him. He only saw control. He only saw momentum. And momentum doesn't slow down to check for trust. It just moves forward, even if the ground beneath it is already breaking. Betrayal doesn't come with warning. It grows in silence, in the pauses between words, in the seconds when trust feels routine. Revan didn't see it. He couldn't. He had built his empire too well, too efficiently. There were no gaps left in his plans except the one closest to him. Malak's loyalty had always been absolute, or so Revan believed. He mistook admiration for devotion, obedience for faith. But faith fades when it is never seen. Each order Revan gave carved a little more distance between them. Malak became the voice of the fleet, while Revan became the face of destiny. They rarely spoke now, not as brothers, not as equals, only as commander and subordinate. And behind every victory, a question began to whisper: who would rule when the war was over? Malak knew the answer, and he hated it. The Jedi would call Revan's conquest a heresy. The Republic would call it treason. But they would all remember him: Revan the conqueror, Revan the architect, Revan the savior turned Sith. And Malak would be a footnote. He could already feel it. The galaxy would remember one name, and it would not be his. So he waited, watched, listened. Revan was preparing for something unseen. New fleets, new coordinates, orders given in whispers even Malak wasn't meant to hear. And that silence, that careful secrecy, broke whatever brotherhood remained. Because in war, secrets are the first sign of betrayal. Malak convinced himself it was self-defense, that Revan was no longer the man he had followed into glory, that whatever had returned from the unknown regions was not his friend, not his general, not Revan at all. So when the Jedi struck, he saw opportunity, not tragedy. They had tracked Revan's flagship, a small strike team, desperate, outnumbered, but they carried something Revan no longer believed in: hope. They infiltrated through chaos and fire. Their plan was reckless, almost suicidal, but the Force was with them, and Revan, for the first time, was not. The battle raged across the void. Republic cruisers shattered under Sith bombardments. Jedi starfighters fell like sparks into the black, but one ship, small, unmarked, slipped through. Straight toward Revan's bridge. Malak gave the order to cover it. He told his crew it was bait. He told himself it was strategy. But deep down, he knew what he was about to do. He saw Revan's vessel surrounded, saw the Jedi boarding party breach the hull, and he waited just long enough for betrayal to feel justified. Then, he spoke. Fire on the flagship. The crew hesitated. They thought he was mad. He repeated the command. Cold, precise, and the sky burned. The blast split Revan's cruiser apart. Thousands died in a flash. The Jedi strike team vanished in the light, and Malak watched it all unfold, the reflection of fire gleaming across his scarred face. For a moment, he felt powerful, free, certain that destiny had chosen him. But when the flames cleared, when the scanners read life signs where there should have been none, the certainty fractured. He hadn't killed Revan, not completely, and the galaxy would never forgive what he had just done. Not the Jedi, not the Sith, and not Revan if he ever opened his eyes again. The explosion should have ended him. It should have erased everything: his power, his name, his sins. But Revan did not die. The Force would not let him. When the blast tore through his ship, when the bridge fractured and the vacuum swallowed light, something ancient reached for him. Not the dark side, not the light, something in between. He fell through the wreckage, bleeding, weightless, silent. Memories flashed not in order, not as stories, but as wounds. Cathar, the Mandalorians, the mask, the Emperor's voice, Malak's laughter, each one flickered and vanished. Then, nothing. When he woke, he wasn't aboard his flagship. He was surrounded by calm, by warmth, by silence that didn't hurt. And for the first time in years, he felt peace. He didn't remember his name, didn't remember the war, didn't remember the betrayal. The past had been carved out of him not by choice, but by mercy. The Jedi had found him, not the Council, not his enemies. Just a team of healers aboard a Republic vessel, searching the wreckage for survivors. They didn't know who he was. His mask was gone, his armor scorched, his identity erased by flame. To them, he was just a man, unconscious, fragile, and impossibly strong in the Force. They brought him to Dantooine, to the Enclave, to heal. But the masters there knew. They felt it before the medic spoke his name. The power beneath the calm, the echo in the Force. It was him, Revan, the Dark Lord of the Sith, the fallen Jedi, the monster who had nearly destroyed the Republic. And yet, he was smiling. Not in arrogance, in innocence. He asked them where he was. He asked them who he had been. He asked what he had done. And when they told him, his eyes filled not with fear but sorrow. The council debated. Some argued to end his life, others demanded imprisonment. But Bastila Shan, the young knight who had led the mission that captured him, pleaded for another path. She had used battle meditation to weaken him during the fight. She had felt his mind before the explosion. She had seen what lay beneath the darkness. There was still light there, still pain, still possibility. She convinced them to try something never done before, not redemption through confession, but through forgetting. If the Force had wiped his memory, perhaps it was not punishment. Perhaps it was the galaxy's way of offering him a second chance. The council agreed. Cautiously, they would let him live. They would let him heal. They would teach him again. Not as a lord, not as a soldier, as a Padawan. A man reborn into the same order he once betrayed. The irony was not lost on them. But the Force works through paradox. And so Revan lived. He trained. He listened. He learned. He meditated as if for the first time. Felt the light side like a melody long forgotten. He helped villagers, repaired droids, listened to laughter. And in those quiet moments, he didn't feel the weight of who he'd been. He felt something else. Peace. But peace built on ignorance is not peace. It's silence. And silence, like the dark, never lasts. Because in dreams he still saw flashes of war, of a mask, of betrayal. And when he woke, his hands trembled. Not from fear, from recognition. The Force had spared him, but not out of mercy. It wasn't finished with him yet. Revan's death had not been the end. It was the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous. Names are not just words. They are anchors. And Revan had no anchor left. He walked the halls of Dantooine like a ghost, spoke with kindness, moved with grace. But something was missing behind his eyes. The Jedi told him he was free, that he had been reborn. But he could feel the silence in the Force growing louder. It wasn't just nightmares anymore. It was presence. He felt it in shadowed corners, in forgotten ruins, in the way Bastila looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. She knew more than the council had said, more than she had admitted. And slowly, he began to remember. Not all at once, but in fragments. A laugh that wasn't his. A planet scorched by his command. A mask he once wore like a crown. The memories came like thunder in the distance. Not clear, but undeniable. And with them came pain. Not just physical, deeper, older. The pain of betrayal, the pain of purpose lost. He began to ask questions, not as a student, as someone looking in a mirror trying to recognize his own face. Why did he know things no one taught him? Why did the Mandalorians fear him? Why did the Force tremble when he stepped into ancient tombs? The answers didn't come from the Council. They came from the galaxy. Because the galaxy never forgot him. Across the stars, the Sith remnants whispered his name. The Republic trembled when it echoed through dark space. Even Mandalorians who had survived the war still spoke of the Jedi who had broken their crusade. That name Revan, it followed him, haunted him, until at last he wore it again. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. There were forces rising in the shadows, familiar ones he couldn't name, but could feel pulling him forward. The peace was ending, and with it, the illusion of who he was. He left Dantooine not as a Padawan, not as a knight, but as something in between. He had the skills of a warrior, the mind of a strategist, and the soul of a man still searching for truth. The Council feared what he might become, but they feared more what would happen if he did nothing. Because Bastila was right, he had seen something. In the unknown regions, In the void beyond stars, something ancient, something alive, something patient, and he knew it was waiting, waiting for him to forget, waiting for the galaxy to sleep, waiting to finish what it had started. So Revan chose not to reclaim his old life, but to face the shadow that had taken it from him. He boarded the Ebon Hawk, a ship as lost as he was, gathered allies, each broken in their own way, each bound to him for reasons they didn't fully understand. Cathar, Mission, Zalba, Bastila. They followed him not because of who he had been, but because of what he was becoming. Not Revan the warlord, not Revan the savior, something else, something that the Force itself seemed to need. He wore the name now not as armor, but as acceptance. A mask shattered, a truth embraced. A man walking back into the fire he once lit, not to reignite it, but to extinguish it before it consumed everything. Because he remembered enough now to understand one thing. He had not fallen alone. He had been pushed, and whatever lay beyond the stars was still reaching. The blast didn't kill him, it erased him. When Revan opened his eyes, there was no past behind them, no empire, no betrayal, no name. The Jedi found him drifting in the void, barely alive, burned and unconscious, but not lost. At least, not yet. They didn't tell him the truth, not at first. To the Republic, Revan was the man who broke the Sith, the Jedi who sacrificed everything to end a war, a fallen savior who had returned to the light. But Revan remembered none of it. Not the war, not Malak, not the voice of the dark side that had once called him master. Only dreams, shadows, flashes of places he had never seen. They gave him a name, a new one. They gave him orders, and they gave him purpose, but they never gave him the truth. Bastila was the one who stayed close. She had led the strike team that brought him down. She had felt his power in battle and seen the wound beneath it. Now she was his protector, and maybe something more. She called him Revan, but her voice trembled when she said it, like she wasn't sure if that was still who he was or who he would become again. And Revan, he could feel it. There was something inside him, not a memory, not yet, just a weight, a pressure behind his eyes, like a storm waiting to remember how to break. The Jedi Council watched carefully. They had gambled with the Force itself, stripped a Sith Lord of his identity, and handed him back to the galaxy as a weapon they could control. But even they knew it was a fragile thing. Because the Force does not forget, he trained again, moved like a Jedi, spoke like a soldier, followed orders, asked nothing. But every night, when the galaxy slept, his mind opened, and something else looked back. They sent him into battle again, not as a general, as a hero. Revan, reborn, champion of peace, savior of the Outer Rim. The Republic welcomed him with open arms. They didn't know they were clapping for the man who had once tried to enslave them. They called him noble, fearless, pure, but Revan felt none of it. Each mission brought him closer to something he couldn't name. A shadow in his chest, a voice beneath his breath. He was winning again, but this time he didn't know why. And sometimes, in the quiet, he wondered if he ever really had. Because if he was truly a Jedi, why did his hands remember the shape of a lightsaber hilt designed to cut down their kind? Why did his dreams show him Mandalorian cities burning, not from justice, but from something colder? He didn't speak of these things, not to Bastila, not to the Council, because if he said them out loud, he was afraid they'd become true. There were moments when he almost believed it, that he was who they said, that the war had changed him for the better, that the darkness had been purged. But deep down, Revan knew better, because when he closed his eyes, He didn't see Jedi temples. He saw thrones, ruins, and a face his own looking back through a mask he didn't recognize, but somehow missed. It was easier being someone else. It was quieter, simpler, but simplicity is a lie. And truth doesn't stay buried forever. He began asking questions about Malak, about the Sith, about the war he had supposedly ended. The council gave him half answers, the kind used to keep people asleep. But Revan was already waking up. Every report, every datapad, every mission file, he studied them, not like a Jedi, like a man trying to rebuild something that had been taken from him, because that's what it felt like, not amnesia, not healing, but theft, like his mind was not wounded, but emptied. And in that emptiness, the darkness began to return, not as hatred, not as anger, as curiosity. What had he been? What had he done? And why did it feel like it wasn't over yet? That question followed him, haunted him, until one day a voice answered back. Not in the temple, not from the Jedi, but from a place beyond the outer rim, from a planet he didn't remember, but had already scarred. Its name pulsed through his dreams like blood. A whisper carried on wind and ash. Malachor. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew what it felt like. A wound, not on the body, on the Force itself. And if he wanted the truth, he would have to go back, not to the war, not to the Jedi, to the moment he stopped being either. Sleep was no escape. It was a door. And every time Revan closed his eyes, it opened wider. He didn't dream of peace, not of Jedi wisdom, not of Republic victories. He dreamed of rooms without walls, of endless stairs carved from obsidian, of fire that whispered instead of burned. And always, he saw himself, but not as he was. This other Revan wore robes soaked in darkness. He stood in ruined temples. His voice echoed commands, and entire worlds bowed to obey. Sometimes the dreams were silent, just shadows flickering across impossible landscapes. A throne built from broken lightsabers, a galaxy dimmed by fear, held in place by one man's will. But most nights, there were voices. They didn't scream. They spoke softly, like they knew him, like they missed him. One voice was louder than the rest, colder, older. It didn't say his name. It didn't need to, because when it spoke, the Force inside him pulled tight like a string being rewound. He'd wake up breathless, hands shaking, heart racing, not from fear, but recognition. He wasn't afraid of what he saw in the dreams. He was afraid of what he understood, that none of it was fiction, that these weren't fragments of a broken mind. They were memories, real ones, buried beneath the identity the Jedi had stitched together like bandages over a wound that hadn't closed. And he could feel them returning, each night a little more, like the Force was rebuilding the man they had tried to erase. Bastila noticed first, not the dreams but the silence. Revan, once curious, had grown quieter, not distant, just deeper. Like his mind was walking paths his feet hadn't followed yet. She asked if something was wrong. He said no, but his eyes betrayed him, because something was always wrong. He knew it in the way his hand moved during sparring, too fast, too aggressive. He felt it in the hesitation when he touched his lightsaber, like it knew more about him than he did. And in the quiet between missions, he found himself staring at the stars, not with wonder but with longing, not for peace, not for home, but for understanding. He needed to know what he had been. Not because he missed it, but because something or someone was calling it back. The Force no longer felt still. It pulsed around him, restless, like a tide pulling him towards something that couldn't be avoided. Not destiny, not fate, memory. It didn't whisper, didn't shout. It pressed, quiet and heavy. The weight of forgotten choices that hadn't finished echoing. And he began to ask himself, was forgetting the past truly healing or hiding? Was he Revan because they told him so? Or because he couldn't be anything else? And if those dreams were real, if the masked figure was him, what had happened to turn a Jedi into a conqueror? He remembered Mandalorians screaming. He remembered a battle above Sirocco, not from history, but from his own hands. He remembered a red lightsaber igniting in darkness, and the feeling of power rising through his bones like fire made of thought. It wasn't memory anymore. It was return. The Jedi noticed too late. They had feared the return of the Sith. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Revan wasn't becoming someone else. He was becoming himself again. And that was something the Order could never control. Because Revan, the Jedi Knight, had followed orders. But Revan, the dark dreamer, had given them. Now the two were merging, not in conflict, in balance. And that scared everyone. Because a man who chooses the dark side is dangerous. But a man who understands both is unpredictable. And unpredictable men don't stay leashed. Not by Jedi codes, not by Sith dogma, not even by love. Bastila began to withdraw. Not from fear of him, from fear for him. She loved the man who woke up with no past. But she saw the shift, the questions growing sharper, the silences growing longer. The eyes that once looked forward, now gazing backward through time. She reminded him who he was now. A hero, a second chance, a path redeemed. But Revan said nothing. Because redemption meant a clean break. And there were no clean breaks in the Force. Only shadows, only echoes, only choices made again and again, until they became something else. One night, he stood at the edge of a cliff on Kashyyyk. Below him, a canopy of ancient trees. Above, a sky filled with stars. And in the space between, a whisper. It didn't come from outside. It came from within, a voice not quite his own, and yet utterly familiar. You were never meant to forget. He closed his eyes. And this time, he didn't wake up in fear. He woke up in truth. Because memory is not just what we recall. It's what we cannot escape. And Revan had stopped running. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Not Bastila. Not the Jedi Council. Not even himself. Not until the ship broke atmosphere and the name rose on its own. Malakor, a planet the Jedi had buried in silence, a wound they refused to speak of. But for Revan, it was the place where something had gone terribly wrong, and something else had begun. He had been there once. He felt it in his blood, a memory deeper than words. Not a battle, a decision, a turning point where a Jedi had vanished, and something colder had taken his place. He didn't know the details, but he could feel the gravity of it like a black hole pulling at his chest. The ship shuddered as it entered orbit. A thick layer of ash covered the planet's crust, like the surface was still trying to forget what happened. But it couldn't, because Malakor wasn't just a world. It was a scar, and scars remember even when we don't. He landed alone. No droids, no allies. Just a man walking into the echoes of his own destruction. The silence was alive. No wind, no birds, just the hum of the Force, but twisted, wrong. It didn't flow here. It bled. Every step brought back fragments. Not visions, feelings, heavy ones, as if the ground itself wanted to speak but could only scream. And still, he moved forward, down broken corridors, past ancient wreckage, towards something buried beneath ash and memory. He reached the edge of a cliff. Below, A crater that looked less like an explosion and more like an impact. Like something had fallen from the stars and torn the planet open. And then he remembered. He remembered the mass shadow generator, the superweapon, created by Jedi General Mitra Surik. A machine that had crushed an entire fleet beneath the weight of its own gravity. It had been his order, his choice. Thousands of Mandalorians died, tens of thousands, but not just them. Republic soldiers, civilians, all caught in the pull of destruction. He had called it justice. He had called it the only way. But now, standing there, he felt none of that clarity. Only silence, only the weight. He fell to his knees, not in grief, in understanding. This was the moment he broke, not from power, from compromise. He hadn't turned to the dark side in a temple, or after some grand betrayal. He had turned here, in the ashes, among the dead, where victory cost more than failure. And where he realized the Jedi Code had no answer for the price he paid. He had walked into the darkness willingly, not to conquer, not to bidness, destroy, to win. And that had changed everything. He stayed there for hours. The Force wrapped around him, not like a guide but a mirror, showing him who he had been, who he had become, and who he might still be. He saw himself in the robes of a Jedi, young, noble, driven. He saw himself in the armor of a Sith, cold, commanding, broken. And now, he stood between them. No mask, no lies, just Revan. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel rage. Only clarity. Because this was never about sides. It was about truth. And the truth was this. He had chosen the darkness to protect the galaxy. And the Jedi had tried to erase that choice. But now, he remembered. And he would never let anyone control him again. The next morning, he climbed back to the ship. Not as a hero, not as a villain. As a man who had found the missing piece and accepted what it meant. He didn't speak as the engines roared to life. Didn't look back at the crater. Because Malachor didn't need to be seen again. It had already done its work. And now, so would he. Not for vengeance. Not for the Jedi. Not even for the Republic. For the balance, for the wound, for the war that had never truly ended. He was ready to face it. Whatever it really was. Because Revan remembered now. And memory is power. Power didn't return with thunder. It came like breath. Like the soft flicker of a flame before the storm. After Malachor, Revan changed. Not visibly. Not immediately. But inside, the war had started again. And this time, it wasn't a war between Republic and Sith. It was between memory and purpose. The Force began to speak louder. Not in visions, but in moments. Tiny cracks in time where he felt more than he should. He'd walk past an artifact and feel like he once held it. He'd duel a Sith and predict their next move before they attacked. He'd hear Bastila's voice, but sense another voice echoing beneath it. A darker one. Older, not malicious, but waiting. It didn't demand obedience. It offered understanding. That was always the danger with Revan. He didn't crave domination. He craved meaning. He wanted to know. And knowledge is never quiet. The Republic continued to call him a hero. The Jedi continued to fear his potential. But Revan, he had stopped listening to both. He began to seek out ruins. Not for strategy, not for battle, for truth. He studied Sith temples, read forgotten texts, touched relics no Jedi dared to approach. And he did it without falling, because he had already fallen, and risen, and fallen again. He knew where the edge was. He just no longer feared standing on it. That was what terrified the Jedi most. Not darkness, but balance. A man who could hold light and dark in each hand and walk forward without flinching. They called him unstable, but the truth was simpler. He had stabilized in a way they couldn't understand. Because power doesn't corrupt all men, sometimes it reveals them. And Revan was beginning to see who he truly was. The voice came again, but this time, not in sleep. It came while he was awake. In the quiet, in the stillness. You were meant for more. It wasn't a command, it was a reminder. He followed the echo to Dromund Kaas, a world hidden behind storms and time, where the Sith Empire had once ruled in secret. And there he felt it, not a presence, a weight, the same one he had felt in his dreams, the same one he had obeyed before Malak's betrayal. He stood before a ruined structure, half temple, half machine, and he remembered, not fully, not yet, but he knew. This was where his path had bent. This was where Revan had served something larger than himself, something ancient, something still watching. The true Sith, the Emperor, Vitiate, not a man, a hunger. And somewhere in his mind, Revan remembered kneeling, not in fear, in curiosity. Because the greatest threat to the galaxy was also the greatest puzzle he had ever seen. And puzzles had to be solved. He left Dromund Kaas with no proof, no holocrons, no artifacts, just certainty. The threat hadn't ended. It had only gone silent, waiting for the galaxy to forget. But Revan hadn't, and he couldn't, because now he understood the stakes. This wasn't about redemption or revenge. It was about survival. Not of a republic, not of a Jedi code, of everything. And he was the only one who remembered enough to act. He knew what that meant. The Jedi would not support him. The Republic would not understand him. And Bastila might not follow him. But still he would go. Into the shadows. Into the silence. Into the Force itself. Not to destroy, but to delay. To hold back the tide. Even if it consumed him again. Because power wasn't his goal anymore. Preparation was. And Revan was willing to vanish, if it meant giving the galaxy one more breath before the darkness returned. He didn't say goodbye. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much. Farewells meant closure, but his story wasn't ending. It was folding into itself. Like a star collapsing into something denser, quieter, more dangerous. He left behind no monument, no title, just a name and a whisper. And those who listened closely, those who felt the Force like a song in the distance, heard it, a warning, a promise, a final thought. Remember me, because memory is the only thing darkness cannot kill. The stars beyond the outer rim didn't shine the same. They whispered, not through sound, not through the Force, but through memory. Revan had been here before. He couldn't say when or how, but every step he took across the dark edges of the galaxy felt remembered. The dreams had grown sharper, the voice more distinct. He couldn't see a face, but he felt its will, its hunger, its patience. It had waited for him, and now he was coming home. The Republic called him a legend, the Jedi called him a question. But out here, titles meant nothing. Only the Force remained, and it was quiet, too quiet. Revan didn't trust silence, not anymore, because out here, silence wasn't absence. It was pressure, like the breath before a scream. He charted the path through ancient maps, hidden coordinates, fragments of Sith knowledge buried in ruins across 100 worlds. Korriban had warned him. Lehon had drawn him closer. But Dromund Kaas, it had pointed the way. The route wasn't mapped on any star chart. It was layered in encrypted hyperspace anomalies, invisible to the untrained, and deadly to the unworthy. But Revan, he had already died once. What more could it take? When his ship broke through the storms, the sky turned black, not from space, but from shadow. Vitiate's empire, hidden for over 1,000 years, loomed before him. Vast, cold, alive. This wasn't the fractured Sith he had faced before. These were not warlords or fallen Jedi. This was an empire of loyalty, of silence, of structure, and it reeked of the dark side. Not the kind born from rage, but from control, from stillness. That was the first sign something was wrong. The Sith Revan remembered had been loud, passionate, predictable, but these Sith did not roar. They waited, and Revan understood this was not a place of chaos. It was a machine, and something, or someone, sat at its core. He didn't hide who he was, didn't disguise his approach. It wouldn't have mattered. The moment he entered orbit, they knew. They welcomed him, not with weapons, but with curiosity. A Jedi who had worn the mask of a Sith. A conqueror who had broken his own empire. To them, he was not a threat. He was a puzzle, a test. They didn't kill him. They invited him in, to their temples, their archives, their history. It was not kindness, it was cruelty. Because the more Revan saw, the more he remembered. Flashes, sounds, pain, standing beside Vitiate. Not as a slave, but as a servant. Willing, eager. That's what broke him. Not what he had become, but that he had once believed. He saw it all now. The campaign beyond the unknown regions. The surrender of self. The moment he kneeled before something he didn't understand and offered it everything. Vitiate hadn't corrupted him. Revan had walked forward freely. And only afterward had he woken up. The war against the Republic, the betrayal by Malak, the redemption through Bastila, it had all been a second act. The true fall came first. And it was deeper than anything the Jedi had ever known. He stood before the citadel, a tower of black stone and crimson light, alive with energy that bent gravity itself. Time felt slower here, thicker, and Revan knew this was the place, not just of memory, but of fate. Vitiate waited inside, not on a throne, not in armor, but in form that barely resembled life. He had no age, no eyes, no soul, only a voice, and it didn't speak aloud. It spoke through him, through blood, through bone, through the fractures of Revan's mind. "You came back," it said. Revan didn't answer. "You never truly left." That part was harder to deny. "You remember now." He did, and it terrified him. Because the moment he looked into the void behind Vitiate's presence, he understood why the Emperor could not be defeated. He wasn't a Sith, not truly. He had stolen the name, worn the title, but what sat behind those eyes was older, more alien, more patient. It didn't want power. It wanted absorption, a galaxy where all minds became one, all will dissolved. Vitiate did not kill to conquer. He consumed to erase. He was not a ruler. He was an end. Revan spoke only once. "Why me?" And the voice replied, "Because you asked." It wasn't mockery, it was truth. Revan had spent his life searching for meaning, for structure, for order, and Vitiate had answered that hunger by offering to replace it. And now, he had come full circle, knowing the truth, seeing the shape behind the mask, and knowing there was no one left who could stop it, unless he stayed, unless he became the wall between the galaxy and the void. But walls don't survive forever. They wear down, they bleed, and Revan was already breaking. His mind was splitting between past and present, between Jedi and Sith, between freedom and fate. But he could still choose, and so he did. He turned away, not in surrender, but in resolve. He would fight, not with armies, not with fleets, with time. If the galaxy wasn't ready, then he would stall the end, even if it meant losing himself again, even if it meant no one would ever remember what he'd done. Revan did not come to fight. He came to understand. But understanding is the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. The Sith Emperor Vitiate did not meet him as a man. He appeared as a shape in shadow, a body long dead, animated only by hunger. A voice that stretched across centuries, whispering through the walls of the citadel. Revan felt the weight of it before he saw him. A gravity that crushed light, that silenced thought. Every breath he took felt stolen. Every step forward, a surrender. He reached the center chamber, where the throne was not a seat but a scar carved into reality itself. Around it, rivers of energy coiled upward, threads of red and black twisting like veins beneath the floor. And in that void, Vitiate spoke. "You came back," the Emperor said, not as greeting, as fact, as if this moment had already happened. Revan didn't kneel, didn't bow, but the air around him did. "I came for answers," Revan said. The Emperor's voice rippled through the chamber. "There are no answers, only continuations." He didn't move his lips, didn't raise his hand. The words simply existed, and in that sound, Revan felt something terrible recognition. He remembered this place, this conversation, not from the present, from the past. He had stood here before, as a servant, as a believer, as one of many who sought to end death by surrendering to it. Vitiate had promised transcendence, immortality, peace through unity. And Revan, long before Malak, long before redemption, had listened. He saw flashes, the ritual on Nathema, the screams of billions drained to feed one life. The Emperor standing at the center, his eyes like twin eclipses, and Revan among them, not resisting, participating. The memory shattered him, his breath caught, his knees weakened. "You see it now," Vitiate said. "The truth you ran from, the truth you erased." Revan's voice trembled. "I stopped you once. You delayed me," the Emperor replied. "Delay is mercy. Mercy is weakness." The words echoed through his mind like fire through glass. He tried to resist, tried to draw strength from the Force. But here, the Force was not his ally. It was his prison. Every attempt to reach for light was devoured. Every thought of defiance turned inward. The Emperor wasn't fighting him. He was unmaking him. Vitiate didn't need armies, didn't need blades. He conquered with truth. "Why show me this?" Revan demanded. The voice answered softly, almost tender. "Because you asked for understanding." And with that, the chamber changed. Walls dissolved. The throne melted into memory. He stood on Nathema again. But not the version he'd seen in holocrons. Not the one whispered in Sith legend. This was the real Nathema Hollow. Silent, drained of the Force itself. There was no wind, no sound, only the feeling of something missing, as if life had been surgically removed. And in that silence, Revan heard his own voice. Not the voice of the man he was now. The voice he had once been. Let it be done. The ritual. The beginning of the end. Billions sacrificed to fuel one soul's eternity. He remembered the screams, the stillness that followed, the power that filled the void. He remembered the Emperor turning to him and smiling. "You will forget this," he had said, "but it will never forget you." Revan fell to his knees. He could feel his mind fracturing. Every wall he'd built to contain the past was gone. He saw everything. The rise, the fall, the redemption, the return. He saw the entire pattern, a cycle of obedience, defiance, and silence. The Force using him, the Emperor using him, history using him. Who am I now? Revan whispered. The answer came like wind through ashes. You are the bridge. And that was the cruelest truth of all. Revan wasn't chosen by destiny. He was a mechanism, a hinge between eras. A mind strong enough to carry the darkness without shattering completely, but fragile enough to never escape it. Vitiate would live through him, and through him, the galaxy would one day burn again. But even in despair, Revan fought. He gathered what was left of himself, the memory of Bastila's voice, the light of the Jedi, the fire of his own defiance. I am not yours, he said. And for a moment the darkness recoiled. Vitiate tilted his head, not in anger, in curiosity. No, the Emperor said, not yet. Then the world folded inward, the floor vanished. Light became sound, sound became pressure, and Revan fell not into death, but into silence. The throne behind him dimmed, the shadow receded, and the galaxy kept turning. None knew where he went, none saw what came next, but the Force did. And in the Force, his echo remained, a whisper in the dark. I will remember. When Revan awoke, he wasn't sure if he still existed. There was no light, no shape, no sound. Only sensation, as if thought itself had been buried alive. He tried to move, he couldn't. He tried to breathe, he didn't need to. There was no body here, only memory stretched thin, fraying at the edges. He was still in the Emperor's grasp, but time had stopped meaning anything. It wasn't imprisonment, it was consumption. The Sith Emperor didn't imprison enemies the way mortals did. He devoured them, piece by piece. Slowly, quietly, and Revan, the one who had sought understanding, was now being understood in ways no being should ever endure. He heard voices, not in his ears, but inside his mind. Some were his, some were others. Some were fragments, memories stolen, twisted, reshaped. You can't kill him. We need him alive. The ritual will fail if the link is broken. He recognized none of them, and all of them. Vitiate was inside him now, not as a parasite, as reflection. Every thought Revan had, the Emperor echoed. Every doubt he amplified. Revan had fought wars, faced betrayal, survived death. But this was different. You can fight an army. You can fight a friend. You cannot fight your own thoughts. At first, he resisted. He tried to hold on to what he could. Faces, voices, the sound of the Ebon Hawk's engines, Bastila's laughter, soft and short. But memory fades fastest when you try to keep it. And one by one, they slipped away. The Emperor wasn't killing him. He was hollowing him. You cannot be destroyed, Vitiate whispered through the silence. You are too useful. The voice wasn't taunting, it was calm, measured, almost gentle. You will stay here, the Emperor continued. You will remember what I allow, and you will forget what I require. The words crawled through Revan's mind like cold light. He screamed, but there was no sound, no air to carry it, only thought. And thought was no longer his own. He saw flashes again, years blending together like shattered glass, worlds burning, faces turning, his own mask floating in darkness. Malak's betrayal looping endlessly, not as pain but as lesson. Every image repeated until it lost meaning. Every emotion dulled until it became obedience. He wasn't breaking anymore. He was dissolving. Then something changed, a spark. Small, quiet. A single thought that wasn't from the Emperor. A thought that felt familiar. I remember who I am. It wasn't strong, but it was enough. The darkness recoiled not far, but enough to breathe. The Force flickered again inside him, like a dying ember remembering fire. He gathered it, held it, protected it, and with it, he began to rebuild. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. He pieced himself together like broken glass. Painful, jagged, incomplete. Every time he remembered something real, Vitiate took something else away. But Revan learned to adapt. He stopped trying to fight back directly. He learned to listen, to hide thoughts within thoughts. He began to whisper lies to himself. Small ones, hidden ones, tiny fragments of resistance buried in repetition. I obey. I serve. I understand. Each lie hid another truth. I endure. Centuries might have passed, or days. He couldn't tell anymore. But through the blur, he began to hear the outside world again. The war hadn't stopped. The Sith Empire had grown stronger. The Republic weaker. Time had moved on, but the darkness had not. He saw the galaxy through Vitiate's eyes. Fleets forming, worlds dying, 1,000 lives ending every heartbeat. It was overwhelming. And yet, somewhere in that endless ocean of death, Revan found calm. Because he realized something the Emperor had not. Control breeds dependency, and dependency creates weakness. The Emperor consumed everything, but in doing so, he relied on Revan to continue, to be his anchor in the living world, the bridge between darkness and flesh. Revan wasn't his prisoner. He was his tether, and tethers can be pulled. He began to focus, quietly, patiently, not on escape, not yet, on balance, on stillness, on thought, untainted by fear. He remembered the code, not the Jedi one, not the Sith one, the one he had built in between. There is no good without evil, no light without shadow. The Force is balance, and I am its servant. The Emperor didn't understand that, couldn't. His hunger was endless, his understanding shallow, and that was how Revan endured. By remembering what Vitiate could never feel, that strength is not in dominance, but in choice. Slowly, the connection began to shift. Not break, not yet, but strain. Vitiate still spoke, still watched. But now, Revan listened differently. He began to see through the Emperor's hunger, to the patterns beneath, the rituals, the weaknesses. He was still trapped, still silent. But he was learning, and one day he would use that knowledge. He didn't know when, didn't know how, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not die here, because death was release, and release was mercy. Revan didn't need mercy, he needed purpose, and even in the dark, he found it again. There was no rescue, no plan, no alarm, echoing down the cold stone of a Sith dungeon. Revan had stopped waiting. The galaxy moved on, but his prison did not. It remained quiet, cold, eternal. No chains bound his body. There was no cell to see, but it was still a prison. One built from the Force itself, and its doors only opened in one direction, inward. Time did strange things here. Sometimes he slept, sometimes he dreamed, but mostly he just watched. Watched through the Emperor's eyes, through the fragments of Sith rituals, through the distant tremors in the Force. Entire generations lived and died. Wars flared and vanished. Worlds turned to ash. And Revan watched it all from the darkness, between seconds. He wasn't Revan anymore. But he wasn't anyone else either. He was what remained. The echo between identities. The scar beneath history. Every now and then, a flicker would appear. A ripple in the Force, like a voice calling from across a great ocean. And for a moment, he would remember. The smell of rain on Dantooine. The warmth of a hand that once held his. A kiss before war. A lie told to protect someone he loved. But each time he reached for those memories, they slipped through his fingers. This place did not allow the past to live, only silence. And in that silence, he began to fade. But not all the way. There was still breath in him, even if his lungs never moved. There was still will, even if it echoed into nothing. And that will kept him from disappearing. Some days, he hated it. He wanted to let go, to fall into the oblivion that the Emperor had prepared for him. But something older than hate held him together. Not hope, not vengeance, just resistance. A refusal to be forgotten, even by himself. And then, something changed. A tremor, sharp, unmistakable. He felt it before he understood it, a crack in the stillness. Not from within, from outside, a presence. Faint, but real. It wasn't the Emperor. It wasn't a Sith. It was light, warm, clumsy, familiar. He didn't know the name, not yet, but he knew the feeling. Someone was coming. He didn't dare believe it, not at first. Too many years of disappointment, too many false echoes and forgotten dreams. But this was different. He felt questions, uncertainty, a mind searching through the dark for something it didn't understand. And that mind was touching his. The Force reached between them like a whisper, not a bridge, but a thread. And for the first time in centuries, Revan pulled. The connection nearly broke him. His spirit had grown thin, unused to light, unready for contact. But he focused. He showed nothing, said nothing, only let his presence be seen. And on the other side, he felt it: confusion, then fear, then recognition. The newcomer did not know him, but they knew of him. His name still carried weight in the galaxy. Even if he no longer did, that was enough. From that day forward, Revan changed again. He became stiller, more silent, not from weakness, but strategy. He needed energy, focus, concentration. A path was forming, faint, fragile, but real. And it led out. He did not know if the Emperor suspected, but if he did, he said nothing. Vitiate had grown arrogant, drunk on victory, convinced that Revan had become part of him, and maybe he had, but the Force had not finished its design. Revan knew the escape wouldn't be clean, wouldn't be noble, wouldn't be his. Someone else would open the door, someone stronger, or perhaps just someone luckier. But when that door opened, Revan would be ready. Not as a Jedi, not as a Sith, as a shadow of both. And he would not leave with joy. He would leave with purpose. Because beyond that prison, the galaxy was still in danger. Not from the Sith alone, not from the Jedi, but from truths buried too deep. From forces even Revan didn't fully understand. He would become something else. Not a hero, not a villain. A warning. That knowledge can be a curse. That destiny has a cost. And that sometimes, the Force doesn't save you. It buries you until it needs you again. And so he waited. Still, breathing without breath. Living without light. Somewhere beneath the surface of a galaxy that had forgotten his name. But the Force had not. There was a moment when Revan no longer knew which voice in his mind was truly his. He had survived things no one should have. Torture, amnesia, redemption, betrayal. Each time, he returned, changed, but alive. But this was different. This was not pain inflicted by an enemy. It was the Force itself, pulling him apart. The man who once stood between Jedi and Sith had become both, and now he was neither. The cell on Dromund Kaas had been silent for centuries. The outside galaxy moved on, wars burned and ended, names rose and fell, but Revan remained. A prisoner of the Sith Emperor, suspended in unnatural life, kept alive for his connection to the Force, kept awake by the weight of forgotten knowledge. But something else began to stir in that darkness. At first, it was only a whisper. A presence, familiar yet alien, pacing just beneath the surface of his mind. It felt like memory. It sounded like doubt. And then it began to speak, not in words, in guilt, in fire, in promises made by another version of himself. There were two of him now. One who still remembered the Jedi code, who still clung to the idea of peace, who whispered, "There must be another way," and another, who remembered only betrayal, who had tasted the dark side and found it not evil, but necessary, who had stared into the Emperor's hollow mind and seen no mercy, no soul, only the need for total control. This second voice hated, and it did not want to wait anymore. The Force had fractured him, split along the same fault lines that had always threatened to break him. Revan the Savior, Revan the Tyrant. Both lived, but could not share the same skin. Each time he tried to meditate, memories bled through. Not memories of his own, but of what he could have been. Visions of paths not taken. A Jedi Council that had listened. A republic that had heeded the warnings. A galaxy spared the Mandalorian War and the Sith that followed. But those visions were illusions. Ghosts conjured by pain. Reality was far more cruel. The Emperor still lived, somewhere beyond the veil, in forms he did not fully understand. He had tasted immortality. He had learned how to leap from body to body. He had become more than Sith could even comprehend. And Revan, even after death, could still feel him. Sometimes it felt like the Emperor was inside him, listening, laughing. Other times it felt like he had gone beyond all feeling, beyond the reach of the Force itself. But Revan hadn't vanished. Not entirely. When the Republic and the Jedi found his body barely alive, clinging to willpower, they tried to bring him back, heal him, save him. But they didn't understand. He didn't need healing. He needed to be whole again. But he couldn't be. Not anymore. Something had stayed behind in that prison cell. Not his body, not even his mind. Something deeper. The part of him that had once knelt before the Emperor and promised to serve, only to betray him. The part that had worn the mask and crushed worlds in the name of peace. The part that had stopped believing in the Jedi and started believing in himself. That part refused to die. And so it lingered, disconnected, yet aware. A shadow caught between lives. A will given form. When his body walked again, fought again, and rejoined the war, it wasn't whole. It was guided, pulled, haunted by instincts that were no longer his own. One Revan wanted peace. The other wanted revenge. And neither could truly win. Because the war they were fighting wasn't just against the Sith. It was against each other. And with every passing day, with every victory or defeat, the divide grew. People saw Revan as a symbol. Some worshipped him, some feared him. The Jedi called him a tragedy. The Sith called him a traitor. But no one understood what he had become. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a man. Not anymore. He was a question the Force itself had no answer for. And the longer he lived, the more dangerous that question became. The galaxy didn't wait for answers. It kept burning. While Revan wandered the shadows of his own mind, the war outside shifted first slowly, then violently. The Sith Empire returned in full. Not the fractured cults or false claimants. The true Sith. The ones Revan had warned them about. And once again, no one listened. The Republic, unprepared and arrogant, reeled under the first strikes. Coruscant was taken. The Jedi Temple burned. And in the center of it all stood a name they had once tried to forget. Revan. He wasn't leading this war, but he wasn't stopping it either. He moved through it sometimes as a warrior, sometimes as a shadow. Neither fully on one side nor the other. He joined battles without pledging loyalty. He helped soldiers without revealing why. He destroyed Sith Lords, then vanished before the Jedi could thank him. No one knew what side he was truly on. Not even him. Because the war wasn't just on the surface. It echoed through the Force, through time, through memory. Revan could feel it in his bones. A cycle, endless and cruel. Jedi rise, Sith return. Republic crumbles, Empire falls. Balance is restored only for it all to begin again. He had lived this before, fought it, tried to stop it, and failed. But something inside him refused to let go. A small ember of hope or madness believed the war could still be ended, that there was a final key, a final act, something that could break the cycle, not just pause it. But to find that answer, he had to go deeper. And that meant war. He returned to places no one dared revisit. Malachor, Dixon, Korriban. Echoes of ancient battles still lingered in the soil, in the air, in the dark corners of the Force. He touched them, spoke to them, fought memories that had never truly died. On Korriban, he stood alone in the Valley of the Dark Lords, staring at the tombs of monsters. Arjunta Pal, Marka Ragnos, Tulak Horde. Their legacies whispered from the stone, still hungry, still waiting. He didn't fear them, not anymore. He understood them. Power, they had believed, could shape the galaxy. But Revan knew now, power only trapped you. It was wisdom that changed things. And wisdom came with a price. That price was solitude. Even those closest to him could no longer reach the man he had become. Bastila, the exile, the Jedi Council, they all tried. And for moments, the mask slipped. For moments, he remembered love, peace, home. But the war always called him back. It didn't matter what side he stood on. The war didn't care who was right or wrong. It only needed fuel. And Revan was endless fire. Some Jedi began to believe he was the key to ending it. Others believed he had become part of the problem. The Sith hunted him, worshipped him, feared him. There were even those who claimed he had become immortal, another myth among many. But the truth was far simpler. He was tired. He had walked through too much death, carried too many names, lost too many faces to time. And every time he thought the war might end, it began again slightly different, but always the same. He started to wonder if he was the reason it wouldn't stop. Maybe the Force had made him to be the balance, and by surviving, he had broken it. Maybe he was never meant to live this long. But then he heard the Emperor again. Faint, distant, yet unmistakable. The war wasn't done. Not yet. The Emperor had returned again, through another host, another vessel, unseen, untouched, still manipulating from the shadows. And Revan knew the galaxy would never be free until the source was destroyed. Not just fought, not just delayed, erased. And if no one else would do it, he would. Even if it meant becoming the thing he feared most. Even if it meant losing the last pieces of himself. Even if it meant letting go of life completely. Because some wars don't end when the guns fall silent. Some wars follow you into the grave. Revan vanished, not in body, in presence. The galaxy barely noticed at first. Another Jedi hero, slipping into the fog of forgotten wars. But the Force noticed. It whispered his name like a scar that hadn't healed. And in a prison deep beneath Imperial space, where light had never touched, he still breathed. Trapped, alone, awake. The Sith Emperor did not kill him. He preserved him, tortured him, broke him in ways no weapon could. Years passed, decades maybe. Time twisted in that place. Revan's body decayed, healed, decayed again. But his mind split. One half hated, burned, screamed for vengeance, clawing at every shadow in search of escape. The other half waited, calm, cold, focused. This was no longer about Revan. It was about the Emperor. Even in chains, he reached out, pulled at the dark currents flowing through the Force, spoke to the dead, listened to echoes, watched as empires rose and fell above his cell. The galaxy thought him gone, but he had never been louder. The Jedi remembered him as a warrior. The Sith cursed his name. Soldiers on both sides told stories of a masked phantom who saved entire fleets, who walked into battle without fear. They called him many things now: Revan the Redeemed, Revan the Betrayer, Revan the Ghost. But they didn't know what he had become. He was no longer a man of flesh and thought. He was will, focus, fire without warmth. His existence held the Emperor in place, stalled his return. That was his final war, now not with lightsabers or soldiers, but with presence. And still, something of the old Revan endured. The man who once loved Bastila, the friend who had stood beside Malak, the student who questioned the council, but still hoped the galaxy could be better. That part flickered, like a candle nearly gone, but it never died. Even as his voice grew silent in the Force, others felt it. The exile, the ones who had followed him into the unknown regions. A new generation who found his teachings, his artifacts, his mask. The war had broken many of them, but they remembered, and that remembering became movement. Revan's legacy was not in statues or songs. It was in choices, in questions, in the way Jedi began to doubt, and Sith began to fear. He had broken the cycle once, and though it rebuilt itself, the crack remained. His name outlived him. In secret temples, Sith Lords whispered warnings about becoming like him. In Jedi halls, Masters debated whether he had been right to challenge the Council. Neither side could fully condemn him. Neither side could fully claim him. He was the middle path, the blade that turned both ways. And even as his body failed, his will burned. The Emperor could not kill him. The Jedi could not save him. But the galaxy still needed him. So he stayed alive, not to survive, but to delay, to wound the darkness just enough that one day, someone else could finish the fight. He didn't need to be remembered. He just needed to buy time, the time for someone better. And in the Force, a presence stirred, a ripple, a call, something new and familiar. The one they called the hero of Tython, another champion born in chaos, another who might carry the burden Revan could no longer hold. The final pieces were falling into place. The war would not end with him, but it could end because of him. That was enough. He closed his eyes. The prison around him tightened. The darkness surged. But he did not resist. He had already made his choice. Let the galaxy forget his face. Let history debate his actions. Let the Force carry his legacy forward. Because Revan, the warrior, the general, the savior, the traitor, was finally ready to disappear. There was no light in that place. No walls, no doors, no horizon. Only the hum of ancient machinery and the slow, patient silence of death not yet claimed. Revan had stopped fighting, not because he had lost, but because he had given everything he had left. And still, something held him together. It wasn't the Force, it wasn't hope, it was something deeper, older, etched into the very meaning of who he was, a refusal to be erased. And then, without sound, without motion, he was free, not in body, not even in mind, but in spirit. The physical prison remained, but the balance inside him had shifted. The wound was open, the pain still deep, but the scream inside had gone quiet. Because something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere beyond the walls of his cell, a light moved. A presence, faint, brave, unbroken. The hero of Tython had come. Not for glory, not to rescue Revan, but to stop the darkness Revan had spent a lifetime warning against. And with that warrior's arrival, the circle began to close. Revan watched not with eyes, but with understanding. He saw the new Jedi take the path he once walked, saw choices made in mercy, and strength shown through peace. And though he had no voice left, something of him echoed. The Emperor still alive, still terrible, was wounded, delayed, and the will Revan had held like a blade for centuries, passed into other hands. He had done his part. The war would continue, but not through him, through those who had learned what he died to teach. That power was not purpose. That destiny was not obedience. That even the greatest warrior could lose himself if he stopped listening to his own soul. His mask, once a symbol of defiance, was now an artifact. Lost, found, passed on. It no longer belonged to him. And he no longer needed it. He had become something else. The Jedi Revan was gone. The Sith Lord Revan was gone. Even the wounded, chained prisoner was gone. What remained was the ghost. Not a spirit, not a force echo, but a memory the galaxy could not bury. He lived in questions asked by students on Dantooine, in warnings whispered on Korriban, in the silence between star systems where great powers once clashed. Some feared him, others followed him. None understood him. And that was how it was meant to be, because Revan was not a story, not a lesson, not a warning. He was a mirror. To Jedi, he showed the cost of blind obedience. To Sith, the emptiness of conquest. To those in between, the pain of walking alone. And though his body faded, his will remained. In the Force, in the cracks between light and shadow, in the quiet. He was there when young warriors doubted their path, when exiles looked up at the stars and wondered if they still mattered, when masters wondered if the code still served the people it claimed to protect. His voice wasn't heard, but it was felt, because he had lived both sides, and in the end he chose neither. He chose the galaxy, the people, the future. Even now, centuries later, Jedi historians argue about what happened to him. Did he die in that cell? Was he truly freed? Was his essence shattered across time? But those questions miss the truth. He did not need to escape. He had already won. The moment he chose to become more than Jedi, more than Sith, more than legacy, he became memory, and memory does not die. It lingers, it waits, it whispers. And when the galaxy forgets itself again, when the darkness rises, cloaked in new names and new wars, Revan will return. Not in body, not in voice, but in the choice. In the moment when someone stands at the edge and decides who they really are. Because some shadows never vanish, some names cannot be buried, and some ghosts never stop watching.